Hi, I'm Joseph Blasi, and I'm pleased to introduce Professor Robert Ashford, who will be leading this session of the Kelso Workshop. Robert is a professor of law at the Syracuse University School of Law. Uh, Many of you know him as the preeminent legal uh, expert on the philosophy and political economy of employee share ownership and second income plans. You may not know that when he was a young law school graduate, Professor Ashford was one of those young idealistic attorneys that worked in a law firm set up by Louis Kelso. So in addition to his serious intellectual and philosophical approach, he has a deeply personal and long view of the development of employee share ownership in the United States. And recently he's taken an interest in this issue personally. I know we will all benefit from Robert's deep and really interesting discussion of the political, economic, theoretical, and policy dimension of employee share ownership. Robert, thank you very much for joining us today. Robert is a faculty fellow and mentor of the Institute, and we really value his contributions enormously.
Hello, my name is Peter Hammerschmidt. I'm a professor of economics at Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. And it really is my pleasure to introduce Robert Ashford, professor of law at Syracuse University, to the Kelso Workshop today at Rutgers University. I must say, as a disclaimer, I should add that I did sign and proud signatory of the Economist letter in support of Professor Ashford's approach to inclusive capitalism. And I do agree that it, and my personal bias, along with behavioral economics, is the most important contribution to economic theory, candidly, since my time of teaching economics for over the last 40 years. I had previously read about a concept called binary economics. I was first introduced to it really in the book Humanistic Economics, The New Challenge by Lutz and Lux, where in chapter 12, they featured a reference to binary economics on a chapter on employee stock ownership plans. And I did find it intriguing. So I was interested when about 10 years ago, Professor Ashford gave me a telephone call. We'd not met. And he suggested that he'd be interested in delivering a lecture to my class that would talk about binary economics. So I invited him in and listened to him. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. I don't quite see the application, but it had an intuitive appeal to it. But I must say recently, and I think very effectively, Robert Ashford has taken what Louis Kelso in 1967 referred to as universal capitalism and his work in binary economics, and has massaged that much more effectively into what today Robert is referring to as inclusive capitalism, which I think is not only more compelling, but a little bit more useful in terms of how it might actually be applied. Let me offer some historical background on this. You're probably familiar with this, I'm sure you are, but the enclosure movement in about 12th century England, actually mostly through 1440 through about 1640, got away with the mindset of the idea that you would live on the land and you would earn your living through what the land had to offer, whether it be farming sheep or cattle or agricultural products, and that joint effort was shared and people earned a living through living off the land. But as you know, as landowners in the UK discovered by fencing in the land and focusing on growing sheep, that ownership could lead to much more income for them. And the labor that was nudged off the land had really nothing to sell but their labor effort. And basically the choice was you can work for your labor, or you could starve, which is not a great choice for most people. And We even saw that in the United States. For example, as recently in U.S. period, as 1840, 80% of the citizens in the United States lived on the land and were earning their income through what the land had to offer. But as you know, by today, in the year 2020, less than 2% of the people live on the land. And as they have not relied on that ownership so much for income, we more and more rely on our labor effort. So basically, in economics today, certainly among other areas, we've created a sort of anthropomorphic view, which is common, that we focus on human effort, and we see that human effort, what we economists call labor, as the way to earn income. And so the bottom line, no pun intended, was that we would focus on labor production. How much labor produced would determine how much it earned or the value of what it produced. And we had a mindset to focus on that labor effort, that was the primary way to earn income. And we got the mindset that hard work will lead to higher income. Only so many hours in a day, which would necessarily limit that income. And if you're going to earn more money, you'd have to get higher wages per hour. Minimum wage laws would help increase wages for those in the lesser skilled positions, perhaps. And yet, what would often happen is that would cause organizations to search for other ways of producing things than labor. So if you still had a job, you might make more, but those without jobs might be a little bit more stressed. And what we saw would be when recessions hit, such as the Great Depression or the Great Recession, or more recently in our great pandemic right now, recession, we saw classic examples that people that relied on labor effort would be forced to work. And this was especially scary in current times with pandemic. These would be people in frontline positions, such as healthcare workers, people in supermarkets, and so on, the work or not get paid, or those that were laid off, then had to rely on unemployment compensation to compensate for no other sources of income. Whereas people that owned stocks, bonds, real estate, and other sources of income could in fact still earn because they were not relying just on labor effort. So when we look at problems such as recessions, depressions, traditional economics has stereotypically taken two approaches. One would be the austerity approach, and that is tighten your belt, hunker down, try and save more, work through this tough time, and things will get better. More of a long-term approach. And this is often used by state and local governments with their fixed incomes and inability to borrow heavily. And so that would be the austerity approach. We saw this in the European Union when Greece got into trouble. Hunker down, tighten your belt. There's also, coming out of the 1930s, the Keynesian economics, the stimulus approach. As Keynes famously said, in the long run, we're all dead. And he would say, let's take care of the problem now. If we have a recession, let's spend some more money. Let's cut taxes. Let's borrow money, deficit spending, which would lead usually to higher national debt, and we'd spend our way out of the problem. So what we're going to consider today in part is, might there be another way? Help us bridge the liberal conservative divide of big government, small government, and so on. And this other mindset, which I think is huge, is who owns the factors of production in the production effort? What other than labor does the actual work? How is it the richest or wealthiest people, if you will, earn money when they sleep and recognize they don't put in more work effort than people that are laborers, but on average, if they own more of the productive resources, they have another source of income. One of the approaches I found very useful in this, in terms of a Lutz and Lux, in their book Humanistic Economics, feature what's called the dual self. And basically what they're recognizing is that we are individuals, but we are also part of society. And the examples are everywhere. Pick a sports example. Pick any sport, but let's say baseball. I might be, as an individual performer, interested in my own statistics, earned run average, batting average, and so on. But I'm also interested in how's the team doing. I'm an individual, but I'm a team member. In theater, I might be a performer, and of course I want to deliver the lines well and do the best I can, but I want the whole performance to go well. I want to interact with others in a positive way. I want the theater to do well. Um, in music, I might be a player, but I also want the concert to do well. And in family, I'm an individual, but I'm a member of a clan. I mean, you get the picture. I like the way Viktor Frankl put it in his classic work, A Man's Search for Meaning. He said, in the United States, we have the Statue of Liberty, and he thought that was good. And that's a mindset of I'm free from constraints, good thing. But he also said we should consider also a statue of responsibility. Not only am I an individual free from constraints, but I'm a member of society. I'm free to contribute and be part of it. It's a freedom to, not a freedom from. And where I think this applies to economic organizations, especially in employee stock ownership plans, is that I am an individual earner, but I am also a part of the organization and hopefully an owner. And many people can participate in owning stock in organizations. And this, I think, is where employee stock ownership plans enter the picture. Because in that type of a situation with a mindset that it's not just about me, it's about all of us, and there's the dual self, is that I want to do well, I want to earn an income, but I want the organization to do well, and I want to work to expand and enhance that profit and that service to our customers, which helps the whole organization do well. So mindset, I think, is huge. I like the way DeWitt Jones, a photographer for the National Geographic, put it, who goes around the world and uses his camera as a metaphor for business decision making. And he said, no matter how hard I work, and no matter how well I've trained my technique in my eye, if I've got the wrong lens in my camera, if you will, if I got the wrong lens in my eyeglasses, I'm not going to see very clearly, or I'm not going to take a very good picture. I often think the argument, what's better, a microscope or a telescope, is not a very good argument. The issue is what's most useful for the situation at hand. And so I like people to consider what's the most useful mindset. For example, when I'm not teaching my economics classes, I also I do work in conflict and negotiation. I borrow heavily from the Harvard Negotiation School, their program on negotiation. And one of the things that they feature is a mindset. And they said, in a conflict, if we see this differently, it doesn't have to be a worker versus owner conflict. And so in a conflict setting, it can be a mindset of me against you, and we get winners and losers. Or another mindset could be you and me against the problem. How do we collaborate in an effective way to get us an outcome where we both can gain? Now, that does not always happen, but it certainly doesn't happen if we don't try. So that's the mindset. So before I turn it over to Robert, let me offer a couple of ideas or some data points that might be useful as we listen to him. I'm borrowing from the National Income and Production Accounts, the NIPA, and they estimate, looking at income data, that the bottom 99% share of labor has fallen 15 percentage points since 1980. Now, this amounts, just in 2012 alone, to a transfer of $1.8 trillion from labor to capital, from workers' effort to the owners of capital. This trend is similar, by the way, in Europe and in Japan. And as a minor note, it's even greater if we use the consumer price index instead of the GDP price deflator. But I don't think that's the point. The point is we're seeing that labor productivity is increasing and wages are actually going up from time to time, but the percent share of the total going to labor is going down as more and more of the return is going to the owners of capital. In 8 of 12 sectors that were studied, they found that faster than average wage growth, which was supported by increased productivity, had experienced a decline in labor share of more than 5 percentage points. So labor producing more, but so much more is going to capital, the percent to labor was actually declining. So academic literature has asked, well, why is this the case? Why is labor effort resulting in less and less return to to the laborers. And there are many reasons. Some of the most prominent seem to be what's called capital deepening, where we are substituting capital for labor and automation for labor and improvements in technology. So labor just plainly is playing less of a role. Capital is doing more of the work and more of the actual production than is labor. Also, there have been what they call superstar effects and consolidation. This is often in the knowledge intensive sectors, the ownership of property rights and mindset, if you will, that more value goes to the owners of labor, excuse me, owners of capital rather than labor. And this is where strong patents and property rights come in. Globalization has reduced labor's bargaining power to get higher wages as companies go to the lowest wage rate areas quite often. And then an accounting technique just allowing for higher depreciation for capital and including intangible capital to allow us to write it off more rapidly and giving a greater return to capital. So what Robert Ashford is going to share with us is basically the mindset of not asking what is labor productivity. That's a reasonably narrow mindset that economists tend to focus on. In fact, we even teach courses on that called labor economics. He's going to look at who actually or what actually does the work in production. Who owns the factors of production? How may we better include more people in the ownership of capital, hence inclusive capitalism? How do we make the ability to own capital that's used by rich people, rich organizations, big corporations, available to poorer people? Because those techniques already exist. So essentially, as Robert will show you later, change over time, I wouldn't say has conspired, but has taken place, that has labor being productive, but being a smaller percent of what we're producing. So what Robert is going to lead us through is basically a mindset of who does the work in production? Who owns the factors of production? How may we better include more people in the ownership of capital, that is inclusive capitalism, so that more people can participate in the wealth that our system generates? How do we allow the systems that make more capital ownership available to those that already have it, the so-called rich, available to those that would like to acquire it? An example I often think of, and maybe it's not the best example, but many of us will buy homes, and we do so not because we have the money to do it, especially when we're starting out, but because we are able to borrow a large amount of money, often supported by the FHA or insurance companies, that enable us to buy the house and then through paying rent to ourselves, so to speak, pay off the principal and the interest. And then once that is paid off, to essentially pay rent to ourselves free and clear. So that concept can be used for the ownership of capital as well. And that at first you pay it off, but then after it is paid off, the returns to that performance of capital, what you own, is then going to you over a longer period of time. Now, as we listen to Robert, I'll invite you to consider how the concept of inclusive capitalism can be applied to specifically ESOPs, but also income inequality issues, environmental quality issues, and so on. I know in my classes I apply it in several ways, even on social problems such as perhaps reparations payments to people that were formerly slaves in the United States and were not able to participate in the wealth that they helped generate. So many different applications of this. So for the reasons that are going to be advanced in Professor Ashford's presentation, binary economic growth is likely to be large because real capital not only does much more work than labor in task after task, and that division is increasing, it is also capable of distributing much more income if that capital is broadly shared or distributed than would ever happen of people just working on their own. It's a win-win outcome to get capital more broadly shared. Plus, if more people own capital, they're in a better position to actually purchase what they and the other organizations are producing, enabling us to continue with the economic growth. So, far greater per capita growth is likely to be realized, and far greater earnings are likely to be distributed, not redistributed, distributed to poor and middle class people as a result of broadening the distribution of capital acquisition and income than would ever occur from increasing labor productivity. Why? Because simply put, capital is doing more of the work. We need to recognize it. That's where the value is. And through ownership of that, we can share that value. So I think Professor Ashford's approach to capitalism is important both economically and politically because it doesn't require the redistribution and it gives poor and middle class people other sources of income that is more diversified rather than just relying on labor or, as we're seeing in today's coronavirus recession, political discussion and decisions about how we should help those that don't have it. So I can agree with Professor Ashford that there's a good reason to believe that the voluntary implementation of broadening capital and its future income will likely make austerity, stimulus, sustainability strategies more affordable, more achievable, and candidly, in some ways, I think less necessary. The most challenging questions yet to be resolved in Professor Ashford's approach to more inclusive capitalism relate not to the new paradigm, which makes sense, but to its voluntary implementation, because there will inevitably be disincentives of free riding organizations that don't participate in this but try to take advantage of the benefits. And so there's always going to be problems like that. But one of my favorite expressions is don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We can still make things better. But the best way to do this is to recognize that mindset that it can be a win-win outcome. It should be a win-win outcome. And I really think it's necessary that colleges and universities, at a minimum, start teaching this concept that people can actually own capital more broadly. The competitive right to acquire capital with its future earnings is probably the most important property right. It's a property right that we have that poor and middle class people need, but really are not aware of. And I believe the single biggest first step to change is awareness. Without awareness, we can't really take action on something if we're not aware of it. So this is extremely important. And I do agree with the essence of Professor Ashford's thesis that the more widely understood the principles of inclusive capitalism based on Kelso's binary economics become, the closer the cause of employee ownership will move from the edge or the periphery to the center of mainstream political, economic, and if you will, sociological consciousness. So this competitive right to acquire capital, which we all have, with its future earnings is the most important property right that poor and middle class people need to know. They've got that right, but they just don't know it yet. And so, as I said earlier, the biggest single first step to change is awareness. Now, I know this won't be easy, but good things seldom are. I had an old tennis coach once used to tell me, Peter, if it was easy, we'd already be doing it. So we know it's not going to be easy. And as I was addressing this with my class last month, I asked them a question. I said, given what we've covered and what Professor Ashford is about to share with you, what's the best time to start inclusive capitalism? Because it's a long run process. And one of my students responded, well, it's kind of like planting a tree. When's the best time to plant a tree? And I think their response was something like 20 or 30 years ago, and I agree. But the second best time is right now. So without further ado, I invite you to sit back and enjoy the presentation and learn from the presentation by Robert Ashford. I know I did. I found it to be extraordinarily helpful, and I am now using it really in all of my economics classes here at Eckerd College. Thank you so much.
Thank you for attending this session on employee ownership, inclusive capitalism, and Louis Kelso's binary economics. I want to express my gratitude for the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations for the opportunity to make this presentation. The title of my presentation is Moving Employee Ownership into the Mainstream Political Economic Debate. the fuller employment case for broadening capital acquisition with the future earnings of capital based on inclusive capitalism and Lewis Kelso's binary economics. The outline of my presentation is as follows. There'll be an introduction and a thesis of the presentation. We'll look at the mainstream political economic debate, which I see as a debate between austerity versus stimulus, less versus more government. We'll explore what inclusive capitalism adds to that debate. We'll explore the principles of inclusive capitalism based on binary economics, with particular emphasis on the concept of binary economic growth. We'll explore its existence and its magnitude. We'll discuss implementing an ownership broadening capital acquisition transaction based on inclusive capitalism. We'll actually have a board meeting and see how that might be achieved without redistribution. We'll explore the economic consequences of broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital, which is key to Lewis Kelso's approach to economic theory. We'll explore government ways to facilitate ownership broadening, and then finally we'll offer a conclusion. Now, although employee ownership has for many years been favored on both the right and left sides of the political spectrum, it remains on the periphery of the mainstream political economic debate. The thesis of this presentation is that the cause of employee ownership can be more effectively moved much closer to the center of the mainstream debate by promoting a deeper and broader understanding of inclusive capitalism based on Lewis Kelso's binary economics. And this involves exploring the economic consequences of broadening the distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. The mainstream political economic debate, as I see it, is preoccupied with conflicting ways of achieving two major goals. One is a fuller sustainable employment of labor and capital, and a broader distribution of the benefits of that fuller employment. At the polar extremes, the conflicting ways are encapsulated globally by the terms austerity versus stimulus. And in the USA, perhaps better by President Reagan's warning that too much government is the problem, and the position of Franklin Delano Roosevelt that more government is the solution. The austerity approach largely builds on classical and neoclassical, you might call it right-wing economics, with the belief that voluntary private transactions, economic activity with minimal regulation will lead to the fuller employment of people and capital. Versus stimulus, it usually involves various versions of Keynesian economics, you could call it left-wing economics, which requires or at least calls for government management of the economy, the creation of aggregate demand to employ capital and labor, and regulation to achieve that employment. And that is believed to create fuller employment. Both fuller employment strategies of capital and labor. Of course, most people are not on either extreme, but rather find themselves in the middle, favoring a mix of the two, some austerity principles, some stimulus principles, and some solutions, some policies like age education or tax cuts arguably work on both sides. And employee ownership could be seen in some ways in that category. Although achieving notable success, thanks to much of the good work of the scholars, practitioners, and also political advisors at these conferences, these strategies have not moved employee ownership from the periphery of the mainstream debate closer to the center, where I think it richly deserves to be. Again, the thesis of this presentation is that a broader understanding of Lewis Kelso's approach to economic theory will move it to the center, because a broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will achieve both the fuller sustainable employment of labor and capital, and a broader distribution of the benefits of that fuller employment. And it will do so without redistribution, and in a way that will make both austerity and stimulus policies more affordable and politically achievable if people still want to pursue them. Cautionary note, the term binary economics has been used in different, confusing, and sometimes contradictory ways. For example, Wikipedia entries on binary economics are a morass of confusion and bad information. Louis Kelso, I think, would be very distressed to read those pages today. As a consequence, the growing number of economists that have come to recognize the importance of the original principles that Louis Kelso advanced in binary economics have urged abandonment of that term and have unanimously preferred the term inclusive capitalism. Another cautionary note, though, is that inclusive capitalism has also been used in different, confusing, and sometimes contradictory ways. Inclusion as to what is worth saying? Well, the essence of binary economics is including people in the process of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. That's the most important inclusion. And I think that needs to be at the core. But because they've both been used in confusing ways, I think an accurate name to the approach that I use is inclusive capitalism based on Louis Kelso's binary economics. Of course, I believe that eventually inclusive capitalism based on these principles will be widely understood. Louis Kelso's role in creating it will be understood, and it will simply be known as inclusive capitalism. Based on these principles, Louis Kelso believed that without redistribution, I'll have to make that point, modest changes in the system of corporate finance will provide market incentives to produce enhanced earnings for poor and middle-class people, enhanced corporate and shareholder profits, reduced need for welfare dependence, government spending and borrowing, and reduced tax rates that will be able to sustain too. At the same time, increased taxable income and enhanced sovereign creditworthiness for those countries that are worried about their creditworthiness, reduced systemic risk for the economy as a whole, and in the big picture, greater per capita growth and greater efficiency. All those things. And obviously, if all of those things are producible by this understanding, it deserves to be in the mainstream and might very well end up there. I believe it will someday. What does inclusive capitalism add to the mainstream debate? Properly conceived, inclusive capitalism adds a unique principle of fuller employment of both capital and labor and per capita growth, fuller employment and per capita growth. That's distinct from political economic thinking in the mainstream today. And this is the principle. Now, sometimes people say, don't just memorize something, understand it. I usually tell my students, memorize this principle. Memorize it first, and then you'll understand it. Do we understand 8 times 7 is 56? Or do we memorize it first and then understanding it? Sometimes memorization helps with understanding. And here it is. Every word counts. A broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. That implies a credit transaction. Buying capital acquisition with its earnings creates the rational expectation of more broadly distributed discretionary capital income in future years after the capital is paid for itself. To whom? To people with a higher propensity to consume. And so if you have a higher propensity to consume in future years, you have more incentive to employ capital and labor in earlier years. Now, significantly, that's a principle not found in Adam Smith's economics and neoclassical economics and Keynesian economics, different versions of it. It's not found in the writings or the thinking or the analysis of anybody who's won a Nobel Prize today. Very few economists understand it. It is new in the same sense that when Isaac Newton said force equals mass times acceleration, that didn't exist before in any language in the world. Or Einstein said E equals mc squared. Those are principles that didn't exist. This is an economic principle that does not exist in the writings from Adam Smith on. It's new in that sense, but a growing number of economists have come to appreciate its power and its value. Although it's a novel proposition, it's implicit in Louis Kelso. He didn't exactly say it in so many words. It's actually based upon a very uncontroversial and commonly understood subject, and that is present demand for capital and labor needs the expectation of creditworthy future consumer demand. You invest in capital instruments today to produce goods tomorrow. It's actually, you can conceive of it as a four-step process. Corporations issue financial capital in stage one. They take the money and hire real capital, they own it or rent it, and they, in stage two, in the labor to employ it, they produce goods and services in stage three, and they sell them in stage four. Capital investment is always future looking. This principle of binary growth, binary economic growth, really encapsulates it. This is a simpler statement of the same proposition. A broader distribution of capital acquisition with its earnings will, without redistribution, promote a fuller employment of labor and capital and greater per capita growth. It's the broader distribution of demand in future years generated by the broader distribution of capital acquisition, which promotes the incentive in earlier years to invest in capital and labor. If substantial, widely understood, and given credence, these implications would move the cause of employee ownership much closer to the center. That's the thesis. If it's substantial, if this growth is substantial, then in the capitalist market system, the most important property right that people need but do not know they need is the competitive right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Notice I say the competitive right. We'll explain why that word competitive is there. This is not a right just to take something out of the system. It's a competitive right. It competes with other people's rights to acquire capital, and it's a superior right once you understand that principle. If substantial, well, is it substantial? Maybe it's not existent. Maybe the reason the economists of the past never saw it is it's just an illusion. Or maybe it's negligibly small. But if it's big enough to be important, then it belongs in the mainstream. And if it's very important, then you cannot solve the problems of wealth concentration, sustainability, fuller employment, the very things that austerity and stimulus strategies are trying to solve and haven't solved. They cannot be solved without this principle. It's very important, and I think it's very important. Exploring the magnitude of binary growth, how big it is, requires an understanding of three basic principles of inclusive capitalism in two very important terms, productivity and productiveness. We'll now approach those issues. The first principle of binary economics is in some ways not controversial. Labor and capital both do work. When I say capital, I mean real capital. There's the human factor, labor, people understand that. And then there's the non-human factor, everything that's non-human. Now, some things that do work can't be owned. For example, the biggest worker on Earth is probably the sun. We get all of our energy from the sun, but the sun can't be owned. The wind can't be owned. The tides can't be owned, but you can own a solar panel. You can own a windmill. Things that can be owned and do work are called capital, called real capital. Each factor does its own work. Now, sometimes factors cooperate together. Consider two people carrying a long item that one person can't carry alone. They have to cooperate. They can't go in different directions, but they're each independently productive. Each one is productive, and if you're paying each one does work and distributes income. Lewis Kelso thought of capital in the same way. And that is to say, the capital instruments cooperate with people who produce things, and the capital does its share of the work. That's the way Kelso looked at it, and I think he was correct. We'll explore this more closely. Now, in some sense, the idea that capital does work is not original with binary economics. Washing machines do work. It's quite obvious that the washing machines do work. Elevators do work. Cows do work, fruit trees do work, they're all doing work of some sort. Horses do work, but in some important ways, economics doesn't consider the work of capital in the same way the economists consider the work of labor. We have a special word for the work of people. It's called labor. We don't have a word for the work of capital. Kelso created the term capital workers, but we don't have a standard term. Now, it's important to distinguish, we'll talk about this more later. When I say capital does work, I mean real capital. That means land, machines, tools, structures. It doesn't have to be physical. It can be a patent. It can be a labor contract where you sew up someone's labor with an instrument that works as capital. But financial capital does not do work. Financial capital is stocks and bonds. Financial capital is a claim on real capital. We'll take a look at that later. Now, the second thing I have to do before I go to the second and third principles of binary economics and Lewis Kelso's approach is to understand the difference between productivity, which is a term widespread in economic theory, and productiveness, which is a term really unique as it's used in binary economics. Productivity is a ratio. It's the ratio of the work of all the factors of production, people working with machines of various sorts, and numbers of people divided by one of those factors, usually labor. When we talk about productivity, we mean usually labor productivity. Productiveness is not a ratio. Productiveness retroactively means work done. That's the work done by someone or something. Prospectively, it means productive capacity. When you look to the future, it's not only the amount of work that's been done, but how fast you can do it, how accurately it can be done, how safely it can be done, and at what cost. And that's a factor as well. So prospectively, it means productive capacity. Both of those factors figure into whether you're going to employ capital or labor to do a particular task. Now, it's important to realize that because productivity is a ratio, the numerator includes the work of the labor and the work of the capital. So labor productivity can rise, although the work done by labor can decrease. We'll look at that again a little bit more closely later. Ratios do not do work. People do work and things do work, and we'll explore the implications of that. Now, what causes per capita growth? That's really the beginning of economics. Adam Smith thought it was labor specialization. The story was, you grow potatoes better, I grow tomatoes better. We have an appetite for both. You grow the potatoes, I'll grow the tomatoes, and we'll trade. We'll specialize. And the gain is in the specialization and in the trade. And that's the logic of international trade. And so he would have a graph that kind of looked like this. The great per capita growth that we see really grew with the Industrial Revolution. Adam Smith looked back a couple hundred years, 250 years to the time of Henry VIII, and he said, it seems the economy has been growing. Nobody could look back 100 years today and say, it seems that the economy is growing. It would be obvious that it's growing, and it wouldn't be any doubt about that. And the basis for that is the Industrial Revolution. It's got something important to do with technology. Now, you could start the Industrial Revolution at the time of the Gutenberg press. That mechanized printing. And we had a great deliberation of what you might call human capital, a lot of knowledge, but the number of things that we were making in the per capita growth and the production of things really started with the Industrial Revolution. When you shift to 1890s, 1900s, with the rise of what they call neoclassical economics, you can no longer ignore the work of capital. And modern neoclassical theory talks about labor and capital productivity. And it's the marginal productivity of labor and capital at some assumed equilibrium, which unit of labor or capital, or which unit, one laborer versus another, or one unit of capital versus another, which unit creates more, and people employ that in production, and that creates the growth. It's this allocation of efficient resources in terms of marginal labor and capital productivity. And that creates the second kind of chart. For many years, labor's claim on national income in America was about 70%, 30% went to capital. That's rent, dividends, and interest. And so presumably, okay, labor is doing 70% of the work, capital is doing 30% of the work. That was long stable, but in recent years, that began to erode, just as Lewis Kelso predicted would happen. Now it seems that labor is getting only about 60%, down to 58% after around 2000, and dropping. And the share of capital income has been growing, and we hear about wealth concentration. And so this productivity notion, we have a decoupling of productivity from the income earned by labor. Again, productivity can rise, but the work done by labor can fall when you focus on the productiveness concept. Now, if you had a kind of heuristic for the Industrial Revolution, because it does have to do with technology, you could capture it by something like this. You saw 10 boards an hour with a handsaw. That's primitive technology. 100 boards an hour with a machine saw. Capital, that's the saw. Technology embedded in the capital makes labor much more productive. So you can hire more laborers, you can make more, saw more boards. And if there's demand for it, you can have much production. That idea filters through the economy with invention after invention after invention. And that's the way it's seen, whether you're in classical economics or neoclassical economics. And Keynes didn't disagree with that. He simply said, for some reason, he had his theory as to why the market doesn't distribute the demand to purchase what can be produced. So the government has to fine tune things. There are reasons why the economy doesn't distribute, according to Keynes. It was the liquidity preference of money. Samuelson used the same idea, and he said it was because wages are sticky downward. So there are different theories of why the market doesn't distribute demand, but that's on that other side of that debate. The binary approach offers a different one, and it's based not upon productivity, but it's based upon a concept of productiveness. So instead of looking at it from this point of view of sawing boards, you could look at it in a different way. You haul a sack a mile and you're exhausted. You put 10 sacks on a horse and go twice as far in half the time. Well, the horse is capital. I sometimes tell my students, represent the horse. Let's give the horse property rights in the work that it does. And tell your horse that the mainstream economics says your role is to make the person more productive. I think your client's going to say, hey, I'm doing the extra work and I deserve the extra money. And then if you take it a step further, pantheism says there's a spirit in all things. So trucks have spirits. So you give the truck property rights in the work that it does, and you put 10,000 sacks on a truck, you do 50,000 sack miles worth of work. You ask the truck, what he thinks about the mainstream notion that the truck has made the person more productive. Trucks will say, heck, I'm doing the extra work. So that's the idea of productiveness. Now, of course, horses and trucks don't have property rights in the work, but the owners do. And that's where the increased productive power is concentrated. So you could create a bar graph like this. This is the productiveness approach. The one on the left, you see 1 sack mile worth of work. Somebody's exhausted, puts 20 sacks on a horse or a donkey. And now the horse is doing 95% of the work. You put 10,000 sacks on a truck, you do 50,000 sack miles worth of work. Not only is the driver not exhausted, but the driver needs exercise, has to go to a gym. So the binary economist looks at the growing productiveness of capital. The technology shifting doesn't make labor more productive. Technology shifts work from labor to capital. That's the concept of increasing productiveness. Now, of course, it takes a person to lead the horse. But the work of leading is not the work of hauling. If you put 20 sacks on 20 different people and you did the leading, it wouldn't say you were doing all the work. And the work of driving is not the work of hauling. It's a different kind of work. It's each individual task. More and more tasks are done by capital rather than labor. Well, if you zoom that curve out over all the inventions, Lewis Kelso didn't think that labor was doing much more work than it was during the Stone Age. People can be 5, 10, 15 times, maybe 100 times more productive than other people if they know enough, they have enough human capital. But the great, huge growth in productive power in the last 150 years, 200 years is the growing productiveness is capital. That's the way Lewis Kelso thought. Another graph that you could show is this shows now not rising productive output, but 100% over a period of time. In the Stone Age, even we're only a few million people, whatever it is, it was 100%, and most of it was labor. So labor starts at 0 at the top and goes down almost 100% labor input. When we just began using tools, well, the more and more tools we use, we domesticate animals, we plant, we understand agriculture. It's easier, less labor intensive than hunting and gathering. And eventually you move to other sophisticated approaches. We're never going to get to 100%, but you're always going to have some human labor. But the direction is over and over again, more and more automation, more and more machines doing what the work people are going to do. Well, how are people going to earn? There are only 3 ways of getting income: through labor, through welfare, or through capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. That's the other alternative, of course. And that was Lewis Kelso's vision. So we have a different way of looking at growth. This shows the labor component on the top. It's the same rising curve, but it's the capital support on the bottom that's really causing the growth. And if you take into account, you modernize that a little bit and you take into account the things that can't be owned, then you've got something that looks like this. You got the labor on the bottom. That's the basic thing. Before human beings had tools, proto people were doing labor. And then you had always had the sun and the wind and the ecosystems doing work. And then finally you have the industrial capital, which causes the great rise. So that's another way of looking at things. And you have these two different theories of growth, which you could look at it this way. One is the productivity theory of growth, neoclassical view or classical view, and one is the binary economic view. So that's the difference between productiveness and productivity. Work done versus the ratios. Ratios don't do work. Labor productivity can rise while labor is doing less and less of the work, and capital is doing more of the work. Now, productivity is important if you want to decide which factor to employ in the production. That's what entrepreneurs do. That's what managers do. They employ the most important mix of capital and labor. But once you've made that decision, which is labor work, it's the capital or the labor that's doing the extra work. Okay, so now as an aside here, it's very important. What do we mean by capital? That's a very important question. If I gave you a long lecture on human capital, most of you know what human capital is, and didn't use the adjective human, but only refer to it as capital, you'd say, well, you're being confusing, not misleading. If you mean human capital, say it, because that's what people expect. But we use the word capital in three different ways, in very confusing ways. We use the word capital to mean money. We use the word capital to mean land, machines, tools, structures. That's real capital. And we use the word capital to mean financial capital, stocks and bonds, which is only a claim on the earnings of real capital, the revenues of real capital after liabilities have been satisfied. Real capital minus liabilities equals financial capital. It's a simple balance sheet entry. If you wanted to confuse people about what their economic rights are in a society, you couldn't do better than to use the word capital to mean money, financial capital, and real capital. No wonder people are confused about their economic literacy. We talk about financial literacy oftentimes, which is how to manage your wealth if you can get it, but we have economic literacy. People go into the voting booth, they may know whether they're for or against gay or straight marriage, they may know whether they're for or against reproductive rights or right to life, so-called different theories of that. But do they really know what's in their economic interest when they vote for Democrats and Republicans? It's hard to say whether they have what we call economic literacy. And it would be helpful to have the word capital straightened out, but also helpful to know who or what is doing the work and whether a broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will promote growth or whether it won't. The binary economist says it will promote growth and fuller employment and more broadly distributed income. And the mainstream economist says, no, don't worry about who's acquiring the capital. It's all going to be told in terms of labor. Now, some hidden truths. Sometimes lawyers understand, other people understand, that a hidden truth can sometimes obscure a more important truth. Here's a truth. Does technology make labor more productive? Does real capital make labor more productive? I think most people graduating from the universities that you're teaching at, those of you who are teachers at this conference, will say that, yes, true. Technology makes labor more productive and real capital makes labor more productive. True. Well, sometimes one statement will obscure a more important truth. Here's what I think is a more important truth, and it's the second principle of inclusive capitalism based on binary economics. Technology makes capital more productive than labor in task after task after task. I think that's a more important truth. When's the last time you heard technology makes capital much more productive than labor in task after task after task? To my experience, unless you've read some of the literature on binary economics or inclusive capitalism, you've never heard that statement. I think students graduating from your schools need to know that it's more important to understand that technology makes capital more productive than labor in task after task after task than it is to understand that technology makes labor more productive or capital makes labor more productive. I think it's a one-sided description of the truth and a one-sided description of the property rights that people need in order to be effectively participating in a capitalist economy. So that's the second principle of inclusive capitalism based on binary economics. And the third principle is this principle of binary economic growth. A broader distribution of capital acquisition promises greater distribution of consumer demand in future years, and therefore greater demand for fuller employment of labor and capital in earlier years. It's the principle of binary economic growth. Now, once you understand that capital does work and can distribute income, you focus on 6 important powers that capital has that is obscured by our common way of talking about them. We hear, for example, capital can replace labor, and we've heard capital substitution for labor. But in reality, capital does more than replace and substitute for labor. Let's look at these ways. Capital can replace labor, but you don't get more production when you simply replace labor with capital. The owner, you get leisure. If the owner was working and now has the capital to do the work, you get leisure. But if you're a worker and don't own it, you've got to look for another job if you've been replaced. You get job training or maybe unemployment compensation. Second thing capital does, and this is almost always true, anytime you replace labor with capital, you get vastly more work done. Capital can vastly supplement the work of, we can't compete with horses or trucks for hauling. We can't compete with computers for calculating. So many things that do work. Capital does work that labor can never do. I read that farmers grew more apples this year because they expected more demand. No, farmers can't grow apples. Only trees can grow apples. We marvel at computers, but we can't make a single computer chip because our hands are much too large. We can't do most of the things that we conceive of in terms of labor specialization without instruments. There is some specialization. I do one thing and then with my work, and then I pass the thing on to you, and you work with your hands and do another thing with and passing things along. But most labor specialization involves capital instruments. You can't be a carpenter without carpenter tools, can't be a farmer without farmer equipment, can't be a doctor without the equipment that enables you to be a doctor. All these things require specialization, and that's doing work that you couldn't do with labor alone. And fourth, of course, capital works without labor. If you don't think capital does work, try living without your washing machine. And try carrying water in a jug for 2 or 3 miles, the way some women have to do in some societies, rather than just turning on a faucet. And thinking of the work that the plumbing system does, it does an incredible amount of work. And of course, it took labor and capital instruments to create the plumbing system, but the work of the labor and the capital instruments that created the plumbing system is not the work that is done by the plumbing system after it's created. It takes people to build, invent, design, install, operate, repair, guard, manage, and finance capital. But all that work is not the work of the capital that's thereby employed. And you wouldn't do all that preliminary work if the work done by the capital wasn't much greater. It's like a principle in physics. You don't put energy into something unless you get more energy coming out of it. If you just get the same energy as going into it, then there's no point in doing it. So those are the 4 real powers of capital. And then capital has 3 financial powers. It can pay for itself out of the promise of its future income. You invest in things that pay for themselves. It's a fundamental rule of business finance, and it's a fundamental logic of leveraging, like the leveraged ESOPs. Second thing is that capital can distribute income to purchase its output. Lewis Kelso used to say the logic of a private property economy, a market economy, is the logic of double entry bookkeeping. Payor, payee, debit, credit. One person's market cost is another person's market income. And the third principle, and this is where one of those examples of Lewis Kelso's sheer brilliance, is that capital can broaden the distribution of its ownership with its future earnings. That's what the brilliant financing technique of leverage ESOPs that Kelso understood and saw. And it was original to him. And it's at the foundation of the principle of binary economic growth. So those three things. So 7 powers that capital have. And if you think that labor productivity is the basic cause of growth, how many times have you heard you can't get growth unless you increase labor productivity? Well, labor productivity is not a cause of growth. Labor productivity is a much more consequence of growth. Now, the labor productivity lets you employ the right mix of labor and capital. Those ratios are important to signals that people measure them, but that's not what's doing the growth. It's more and more productive capital with less labor input per unit of output. That's really the binary vision. So production is income, the distributive power of capital. Just as capital has the power to do much work, much more work than labor, it has the power to distribute much more income than labor. We're trying to distribute the earning capacity for the great masses of people through jobs and welfare when the technology says that production is increasingly capital intensive. And Lewis Kelso reasoned that as production becomes more capital intensive, the way people earn needs to become more capital intensive. That broadening distribution of capital acquisition, and it can be achieved with the future earnings of capital without the need for any redistribution. So we go back to these two terms: productivity, the ratios don't do work, productiveness, work done retroactively, and productive capacity, respectively. And that's those basic principles. And we have these two graphs that show the different concepts of growth. Okay. Now, once you've got that down, two other things emerge that are important for economic understanding. And they're not immediately apparent, even to economists. This changes the basic theory of price that operated and gave Adam Smith his vision of the foundation of economics that we still have today. Adam Smith believed that things are worth the work people are willing to do to acquire them. He thought that people's living standards were incentivized. What do you value? What do you value in a certain style of life? And given that value, you'll be incentivized to do the work to get them, either to grow them and do them yourself, or to do work to trade with somebody else, or to earn money to pay for somebody else's labor and the capital to buy what you want to buy, what you consume. You express value, other people express their value, and the market is that mechanism where the different expressions of value compete. When you get agreement between the buyer and the seller, you get the prices, competitive prices. So if you want to get a sack from A to C, well, you got to be willing to haul it there if all you've got is your labor power. And if you can only got the strength to get it to B, that's all you're going to get. So you can express your value. But if you own a horse, it's not merely the value expressed by the work you're willing to do, it's the value expressed by your willingness to employ your capital to do. Capital more broadly owned will produce more because people will employ their capital more. Well, sometimes it's through the mechanisms of corporations or co-ops or other mechanisms. But the decision to employ is a decision of whether you should employ labor or capital. And the source of value is not simply the willingness of a laborer to work. It's also the willingness to employ your capital to do. Now, some people will say that labor theory of value, which I've revealed here, was the way Adam Smith saw it. It's also the way Karl Marx saw it in terms of his congealed labor theory of value. But it's modern economic theory is dispensed with that because we've got the cost of production theory. That's the supply side, which you look at the cost of production, and you look at the demand side, which is not simply labor theory of value, but it's the distribution of demand through all sorts of mechanisms, and it's the revealed preferences that people have. Some people get money from welfare, some people get it from capital, some people get it from labor. So we really don't have the labor theory of value anymore. But the truth is that when 1% of the people own 40 to 50% of the capital, which is the case today in most industrial economies, and with 10% of the people own 90% of the capital, and 90% of the people own little or no capital, then the price of goods and services, for the most part, are going to be the work people are willing to do to get them, plus augmented somewhat by welfare, and a little bit by the narrow capital acquisition. But for most goods and services, it's not the price of capital. that's at work here. When you get $15 million for Rembrandt, yeah, you're talking about the earnings of capital. When you get people who are buying Lamborghinis, yeah, I think that's true. Even maybe the high-end Teslas, you're getting the earnings of capital. But for most people, most consumer goods, it's the earnings of labor that's at play there. So I don't think we've really gotten very far from that. The ways that it takes to employ people will change as people begin to own more capital. Some people say, well, if you're earning capital, it'll take more money to lure you away from leisure. Some people just drop out and say, I'll live, once I'm earning 40% of my income from capital, I don't need to work. You have to pay me more to work beyond that. Other people say, well, no, if you're earning from capital, then you can work at lower wages and do more eleemosynary and charitable work. You don't have to join the rat race just to have these high-paying, boring jobs. You can have more creative jobs and work for less. It'll probably go in both directions. Who knows where it'll end up? But the point is, prices will change once this principle of binary growth is understood. So things are worth not only the work people are willing to do, but also the work they're willing to employ their capital to do. And that also changes the revenue capacity, the rate of return of capital. The conventional view, if you revenues, you have to first of all employ people. So that's that agreed upon wage, which is going to change once we understand the principles in binary economics. And it's also the scarcity of capital. You invent something new, you've got monopoly power over that thing, you can get a very high return on that capital. You begin licensing it out if it's a patented thing, or people begin copying or figuring other ways to do the same. Capital becomes more plentiful. The law of supply and demand says that the profit you're going to make is going to be less and less. If you get to some perfect equilibrium where everybody has everything, some static equilibrium, then more capital is worthless. Why invest in capital? Nobody wants anything else. You're already producing everything everybody wants. But of course, the existing capital is not worthless. It still has a value. And the value of stock markets for the last 200 or 300 years have been generally steadily going up, with some ups and downs, but generally up.
And of course, not only is the existing capital still producing goods and services along with labor that people want, need, but the owners of that capital, either individually or through corporations, are continually producing and more productive capital and more productive processes. So the value of the equities representing the real productive capacity of capital are continually rising.
Diversified portfolio in stocks is the surest way to beat inflation. So the earning capacity of capital is influenced by the current demand, but also the greater future demand. And that's the third principle. That's what binary economics changes. The distribution of capital acquisition will increase the earning capacity of capital. If capital is acquired more broadly, it will distribute more demand and the rate of return on capital will increase. That's simply another expression of the principle of binary economic growth. So all those things change. So these basic insights, capital does work, technology makes capital more productive than labor, and the idea that a broader distribution of capital acquisition distributes more discretionary demand in the future and therefore more incentive to invest in capital and labor in the present, that changes prices and the capital rate of return, that changes classical economics, which is concerned with growth. It changes neoclassical economics, which is concerned with optimal efficiency, and it changes Keynesian economics, which is concerned about fuller employment. And that's why I say this theory is a distinct theory of fuller employment and growth. It's also a distinct theory of efficiency, but that's a little bit more subtle a concept, and it's not needed for this major debate between austerity and stimulus to understand. Okay, now, how would we implement this? Implementing voluntary ownership broadening inclusive capitalism financing. It's an attention getter. In the time I've spoken thus far, Paris Hilton, even while sleeping, has acquired, without working, more capital with its future earnings than most people will acquire in their lifetimes, no matter how long and how hard they work. That's an attention getter. And that's true. Now, Paris Hilton, I happen to speak at Hilton Hotels, and she happens to be the only heiress to a big hotel chain that I know about. There may be others. She may be very socially conscious and productive in other ways. And she may someday want to finance broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital so that she's known for something more than she's already known for today. But how has she done it? Well, she's used the help of corporations. She's acquired capital with the earnings of capital and much of it with its future earnings. That's how she's done it. So it's all tied up in the corporate structure. She's used the institutions of corporate finance, corporations, fiduciaries, lenders, financial risk insurers, some of them private, some of them governmental, and the central bank, which controls the money supply through reserve requirements of lenders, interest rates, and monetization. All three of those mechanisms. And that's what she used. And while she sleeps, they go on working for her. Lewis Kelso was a great philosopher. He was a great financial person, but he was also the first corporate finance lawyer for the people. He was a brilliant corporate finance lawyer for the people. He never lost sight of the interests of people in acquiring capital, but the earnings of capital. This is a diagram that he drew. It shows the 6 basic institutions of corporate finance as he saw them.
It shows a corporation, top left. It shows a lender, that's in the middle on the top. It shows an investor, that's the bottom left. Could be an individual investor, could be investment advisor, could be a trustee. And the far right, it shows a capital credit insurer or reinsurer. In the bottom right, it shows a government reinsurer. On the top left, it shows that the corporation has planned growth. Most major corporations do plan to grow in an economy that's generally growing, like the US economy at 2 or 3%. It could use retained earnings. It could use borrowed money. So it could borrow money from the bank and pay for it with the future earnings of the capital. Or it could sell stock to investors, private investors, or a trust representing investors, and use that money to acquire the capital. Just as the corporation could borrow money to acquire capital, so the investors could borrow money to acquire capital. A capital investment needs usually 2 sources of repayment: the anticipated cash flow that the lender can secure, and also some security. Sometimes the corporation will let it securitize its assets. Sometimes it will pledge additional security. But security can also be provided by third-party capital credit insurer, and that's what you see on the top right box. AIG was a capital credit insurer. Lloyd's of London for years was a capital credit insurer. AIG was a company that went bankrupt during the 2007-8 financial crisis. We bailed it out. It was too big to fail. Can it be abused? Can people end up doing foolish things? Yes. Can we have unforeseen risks that economists didn't see and financial advisors didn't see? Yes. But nobody said that we don't need third-party capital credit insurers. They're a vital part of our economy. And some things for which the government is really concerned, we have government reinsurance. That's the way the FHA works, to broaden home ownership. Can that be abused? Yes. Is the institution an important institution that needs to be fortified? Yes. And the central bank, which in our economy is the Federal Reserve, and its role is to preserve a stable credit system, a stable monetary system, and a stable price system. And so those are the 6 basic institutions of corporate finance as Lewis Kelso saw them.
And again, he always advocated all 6 of those. Now, when I teach binary economics, I emphasize the private aspects of it first. Would government reinsurance help? Yes. Would monetization help? Yes. Once you understand the principles of broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital, once they're widely understood, you certainly would want capital credit reinsurance, and you certainly publicly the public pool for that. That would be a very good thing to do. And you certainly would want to monetize capital acquisition if you thought it was potent enough. I think it is. Right now, we're monetizing public debt, buying government bonds. That's monetizing past government spending. We could monetize capital acquisition, but do you need it for broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital? No. capital is so productive that you could achieve it entirely profitable. And so I start with these first four private institutions: the corporation, the investors, the commercial lenders, and capital credit insurers, those four entities. And if it works for corporations and the rich, it can work even more profitably if more people are included in the process. That's the basic principle of binary economics. Now, how do corporations pay for their capital? 70% with retained earnings, that's the past earnings of capital. 25+% with borrowed money.
That's repaid with the future earnings of capital.
About 5% minus, many years negative when you look at the major credit-worthy public corporations, publicly owned corporations, sale of stock. In most years, the Russell 3000, that's the 3,000 largest credit-worthy publicly owned corporations, they buy back more shares than they sell because rather than get dividends, shareholders would rather sell some of their stock to get capital gains. But a good quarter plus capital acquisition is paid for with the future earnings of capital. The purpose of corporate finance is to enable a corporation to acquire capital assets before it's earned the money to pay for them. This gives shareholders a great benefit: indirect access to non-recourse corporate credit with liability limited to their investment. The corporation's liable for the borrowing, but the shareholders are not beyond their investment. Now, how does a corporation do this? Well, the law gives corporations great advantages that private individuals don't have. Corporations have perpetual existence. They have limited liability for the shareholders that invest in them. They have centralized management, including control over the revenues. The shareholders don't control the revenues and whether retained earnings are kept or distributed as dividends. And the corporations have stable existence. The shareholders can come and go, but the corporations make these stable contracts, which includes borrowing money to acquire capital with the future earnings of capital. Now, these four superhuman powers that individuals don't have could not be privately negotiated. If you have any extreme libertarians that say, who needs government, you couldn't get these things. There's one famous book called Atlas Shrugged, but written by Ayn Rand, a famous libertarian. Atlas can shrug all he wants. He can try strong arm as many people he wants. He's not going to get these qualities. And it's the corporate enterprise that includes the billionaire. You show me a billionaire, I've shown somebody who's used corporations. These corporate rules grew up with the Industrial Revolution to equip these superhuman beings with the capacity to operate globally in the post-industrial world. And there are advantages that right now inure primarily to a limited number of people. 1% of the people own 40% of the capital, 10% own 90%, leaves 90% owning very little or nothing. Now, here's some other misconceived notion. Who owns the corporation? Most people are going to say the shareholders own the corporation. That's false. Nobody owns the corporation. The shareholders own shares issued by the corporation. Corporation does not have an owner. And the lenders wouldn't loan to the corporation to let them acquire 25% of their capital with the future earnings of capital if they didn't have these superhuman powers. If the shareholders own the company, the lenders will want to talk to the shareholders. Who runs the corporation? Well, I think most people know it's the directors and officers. The shareholders do not run the corporation. Now, if you're Jeff Bezos or Mark Zuckerberg, you may have a controlling interest. And there are many of those. But nevertheless, it's the directors that run the corporation. And these major credit-worthy companies in the Russell 3000, most of them are not controlled by any particular shareholder or group of shareholders. And whose wealth must be maximized? It's the corporation's wealth, not the shareholders' profits. Shareholders only have rights to profits after the corporation declares dividends. The only corporations where the shareholders have the absolute right to the profits are either when the corporation is in dissolution and it no longer has long-term credit to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, or when the corporation has no conceivable good faith need for the revenues. But you show me two corporations, one that's appropriately investing in research and development and other things that ensure its long-term stability, and one that's maximizing profits in the short run, but not investing them for research and development. I'll show you a corporation that maximizes its profits in the short term, but won't be around in the long term. The long-term value of corporations is in the discretionary ability to maintain market share and revenues enhancement over a long period of time. So these give these shareholders this great advantage that non-shareholders don't have. Non-shareholders have to first earn money to acquire capital before they can participate in this. And requiring people to earn capital via their labor while other people are acquiring capital with the future earnings of capital is like expecting people to compete with horses for hauling. Can't be done. Atlas can do it, a few people can do it, but the vast bulk of people will remain poor, or at least largely dependent on labor income throughout their life, because they don't have access to capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. Louis Kelso saw that, and that was the vision that motivated him to the creative work that he did. And again, it's highly concentrated. 1% of the people own 40 to 50% of the wealth, 10% of 90%, and 90% are left scrambling for the rest. And many of those people have a negative net worth. And most of the people in the 10% are not acquiring capital for current dividends. They're basically acquiring capital to cover them through their retirement, hopefully. It's a very few number of people who can live on their dividends alone. Kelso believed it should be much broader than that. And eventually, if we follow his policies, it will be more broader than that. I can envision a time where people are earning 20, 30, 40% of their current income from capital. And that will be a much more robust economy. Okay. And the principle of binary growth says that if corporations can acquire 25% of their future earnings today, it can work even more profitably and more people are included. Okay. These are the institutions of corporate finance: corporations, fiduciaries, lenders, financial risk insurers, the government reinsurer, and the central bank. Helpful, but not necessary. You know, the eleemosynary organizations. Ford Foundation, I hear on NPR that they want to eliminate inequality in all of its forms. I think the greatest inequality is the inequality of not being able to acquire capital with his future earnings the way Paris Hilton can. That's the big inequality. Louis Kelso sure spotted it. Ford Foundation wants to eliminate the big inequality. That's the thing to have inclusive capitalism.
Well, with what we've learned so far, we are now ready to have a board of directors meeting. Think of N Corp. It's one of the 3,000 largest credit-worthy U.S. publicly traded corporations. It's one of the Russell 3000 corporations. It's operating in the U.S. economy, which is growing at a default rate of 2 to 3%. Recessions occur, but usually not more than one per decade, and rarely they last more than 1 year, maybe 2 years at most. N Corporation has a creditworthy capital acquisition plan. Almost every corporation in the Russell 3000 has one of those. It's one for the next year, and they also have a long-term capital acquisition plan extending many years. N Corp is not over-leveraged, meaning to say it can borrow at an advantageous rate if the lender and it believes that it can make much more money than the interest rate. N Corp is a typical corporation in the Russell 3000. The corporate decision-making, the fiduciary duty of directors and officers is not to maximize share prices every moment in time. It's sometimes called short-termism, but rather to develop plans to maximize corporate wealth over a time period determined by the fiduciaries. That's black letter law. To finance the capital acquisition, N Corp can use retained earnings, loans, or corporate shares, and we've seen those percentages. The duty of the directors and officers is to choose the alternative that maximizes corporate wealth. If the transaction is extraordinary, it must be approved by the N Corp's shareholders, who may vote their own selfish interests. But annual capital acquisition plans are not typically extraordinary, so the shareholders may be able to vote the
directors out if they don't like what they've done over a period of time. But the decision to make this corporate capital acquisition plan resides with the directors. And if they've got a loan at maybe 4 or 5%, and they think they're going to make 8 or 9, that's been their history, 8 or 9%, and the lenders think the same thing, it's obviously a wealth maximizing proposition for the corporation. The knock on the door. Who's there? It's Bill. We say, well, Bill who? Well, it's Bill Gates. What does Bill Gates have to say to the board? Bill Gates says, I like everything you do. I've been studying your company. Don't change anything. All your prospects for the future can be as bright as you think they are. And I agree with you. But I can bring you a synergy gain because I've studied your company and I have influence with Microsoft. And we work together, and with the shares you sell me, don't borrow the money. With the shares you sell me, you can take the money and make the capital acquisition plan, private placement, no regulation to speak of. And I'll get the gain from this investment. I'll also get the synergy gain because of my investment in Microsoft. Well, we would have to consider that. I mean, he may be wrong, he may be right. We'd have to do what's called due diligence to make sure that that is really more wealth enhancing. And if it is more wealth enhancing for the corporation, we might want to forego that borrowing, which is not as wealth maximizing. That serves both the corporation and the shareholders. So as we're pondering that, who's there? It's Warren. You say, Warren who? We say, well, it's Warren Buffett. And he gives us the same story, except his synergy gain is with the shares owned by Berkshire Hathaway. And he has considerable influence there. Who's there? Well, it's Jeff Bezos. He's got a similar deal with Amazon and Zuckerberg with Facebook. So this can go on, these different deals. And if there's a gain, we'd have the obligation as directors to choose the gain that's best for the corporation. That possibility does exist. And by the way, if Bill or Warren were to say, or any of these people were to say, by the way, I'm not going to take money out of my bank account, I'm going to borrow the money. Do we care? Well, we pass it by our lawyers and they say, no, cash is cash. No problem with Bill if he wants to borrow the money, as long as that loan doesn't jeopardize the synergy gain he's offering for you. And if Bill or Warren or Jeff were to say, by the way, typically corporate credit like this, if you were borrowing it directly, you'd have to give a security interest on your assets. And if I'm going to borrow the money, I'll have to give a security interest. I could encumber my assets, but I might also want to buy third-party capital credit insurance instead. And if I think the gain is much, the synergy gain, this wonderful synergy gain, is big enough as I think it is, it'll be worth the capital credit insurance, and I'll have my assets unencumbered for other purposes. So all that could go on with the institutions that exist right now, for the institutions that work for Paris, and all these individuals while they're sleeping. So that's and this could be done by the investors themselves, or by an investment intermediary, or even by a trust. Now, we're still having this board meeting, and let's assume sometime in the future that graduates from American universities who are now running the institutions of corporate finance, the corporations, the fiduciary trusts, the lenders, the capital credit insurers, even government reinsurers in the central bank, but we don't really have them in the picture yet. And they are all taught the principles of inclusive capitalism based on binary economics. So they understand that capital does work just as labor does work, that technology makes capital much more productive than labor, and that a broader distribution of capital acquisition with its future earnings, that's a credit transaction, just like the one that Bill and Warren might be contemplating, will produce significant growth. And of course, the principles of binary economics say that if it works for Bill, Paris, Warren, and all those people, it can work even more profitably if more people are included in the capital acquisition process. That's the essence of what inclusive capitalism based on binary economics brings to the table. So the trustee can be representing not Bill, Warren, and Jeff and Paris. It can be representing employees of companies, customers of companies, neighbors of companies. Think of company towns. And even welfare recipients. Right now, the board is, the corporations paying corporate taxes to support welfare recipients. Corporations try to zero out their tax rates, but they don't always succeed in doing so. And of course, individuals are paying for that too, individuals in income brackets. So what might TIAA-CREF or Vanguard or Fidelity say? They say, well, we bring you a gain, the synergy gain that Bill and Warren can't bring you, Jeff can't bring you. We bring you the pent-up appetite of your employees, your customers, your neighbors, and even welfare recipients and others could be bringing in, could it be in capitalizing people from other countries with the pressure to leave their homes and their culture as they come to this country because they can't earn a living where they are would be reduced. And the pressure of the people who live near the Amazon to sell the Amazon forests because they're working with plutocratic capitalism rather than ownership broadening capitalism. Maybe they wouldn't have to sell. So maybe there are others we'd want to include too. This is a possibility. And of course, they've got to make the case that this is a more competitive offer. How might they make that case? Now, I want to say that we are dealing with this in the aggregate. This is corporation N, but think of all the 3,000 corporations all having board meetings at the same time, thinking about this. So we're going to look at it first on the aggregate level. Then we're going to explore how to bring it down to the individual company level. Okay, well, what they might show, what the TIAA-CREF or Vanguard or Fidelity might show is a graph that looks like this. Now, this is a graph that has time along the bottom, and it has the percentage of capital acquisitions over time that are fully paid for. So in the first 7 years, let's assume we have a capital cost recovery period of 7 years. I assume 7 years because it's a number that reflects roughly the growth rate of the economy. Could be 10 years, wouldn't really change the principles. Could be 3 to 5 years. Louis Kelso, in his experience as a corporate finance attorney, always said that capital acquisition by major corporations, 3 to 5 years is the rule of thumb. But let's say 7 years. So in the first 7 years, all the trust is doing is it's borrowed the money. It's got secured capital credit. Dividends are flowing to enable the trust to repay the loan, but the loan's just being repaid. It's just a flow through to repay the loan. But in years 8, 1 year was the capital. This year 1, if we finance it with ownership broadening capital, then in year 8, 1 year's capital acquisition is now pumping income to whom? Employees, customers, neighbors, and welfare recipients, all of whom are likely to spend more of it on consumption than if it were acquired by richer people. If you do it again in year 2, then in year 9, a second year's worth of capital has paid for itself. That year of capital is now pumping income to those individuals. In year 3, that goes to 10. In year 7, the 14th year of capital will have, in year 14, the 7th year of capital will have paid for itself. So this is what in the math biz they call a logarithmic curve. It never gets to 100%, but it approaches it so close that eventually you can't see the difference. You're financing incremental productive capacity of capital, more capital-intensive production, in a way that it's increasingly distributing consumer demand to people who buy the product. Again, we're operating at an aggregate level. And so that's the kind of graph that could be shown. And it doesn't have to be any particular amount. You could find company N could finance 10% it's this way. Company B could finance 15% if it's capitalized. It doesn't have to be all of it. It could be some portion of it. So what does this chart assume? It assumes a 7-year capital cost recovery period for the capital investments. It shows a number of years of annual acquisitions that have paid for themselves. 7 years, could be 10 years. In every year, it assumes some number, N, of America's credit-worthy largest corporations, I think in the largest 3,000, could add some more, have profitably utilized binary financing to acquire some percentage of their capital investments. Doesn't it? Could be 15%, could be 30%. It could be determined by the board. It's voluntary. It assumes that the capital credit insurance is profitably priced. What does that mean? That we will repay the lenders for those financing that fail to repay. The insurance is priced. You're taking insurance premiums high enough to cover the losses. Capital credit insurance companies do that all the time. Insurance companies do that all the time. So the acquisition loans that are being repaid, the N and X are net of those failures. This is squeezing out the failures under the assumption the same market pricing system that enables insurance companies to insure various kinds of risks, including the risk of capital investment, are simply going to operate in the same level they do here. Can you get defaults like AIG had? Yes. Are they rare? They're extremely rare. Something has to really be out of ordinary, like the recession of 2007. Could happen again, yes, but it's not likely to happen. And problems would exist if the same thing happened if we weren't broadening ownership. It assumes that NX and the rate of return are constant. Now, with the binary economic growth, N and X and the capital rate of return would increase. But this chart just assumes constant. We're not augmenting it. The repayback period would be quicker in that case. Now, it also assumes that the shares are what Lewis Kelso called full property rights, or could call them full return ownership broadening shares. You see, if the lender made the loan directly to the company, and we started with a creditworthy capital acquisition, which loan would have made to the company would have paid out of its revenues, the interest, and out of its earnings, repaid that part of the principal. So it's getting direct access to that earning capacity. Shares, even dividend-paying shares, rarely pay more than 2 or 3%. That's not fast enough. That's not competitive enough to acquire capital at the rate that's necessary. So Lewis Kelso reasoned that the full return, that means you take the revenues, you keep money for depreciation because you want to restore the capital that's being acquired to its usable state. If it wears out in 10 years, then we need to take 10% out of the year. Tax laws allow us more accelerated depreciation to help capitalists. And you want to have deductions for research and development. Those are the things reduce profits. Those are expenses because we're not going to have the same capital instruments when the instruments are worn out. We're going to want technologically current ones. So the full return is net of the operating expenses, any interest expenses the corporation has, and it's net of these capital saving and restoring devices of depreciation and research and development. But that full net payout then goes first to the trust and then to begin paying income to the beneficiaries. Now, the other change, and this would require a change in tax law, I think it's a no-brainer once these ideas are widely understood, and again, we're assuming they're widely understood. Why should the corporation pay taxes on the income it's earning on these shares when it's required to fully distribute them, first to repay the loans, and then to provide income for the new beneficiaries, the employees, customers, and neighbors and welfare? It would be nonsensical. The corporation has never had use of that income. It's a flow-through, very much like you might call it a subchapter S, or even a partnership. It's flowing through to the beneficiaries. So that is an amendment, but it's a pretty straightforward and logical amendment. The whole purpose is to get income to people so you can get the binary economic growth. Now, to make the case further, we look closer at these first 14 years. You don't have to go much further than that. What's happening in year 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12? Well, you're getting more income, more capital income distributed to employees, customers, and neighbors and welfare recipients. That's what's going on. Now, these people have more demand. So the plans of companies that are making consumer goods have to expand. They didn't need a new factory, given the fact that capital acquisition was narrowly acquired to people roughly in proportion to their existing wealth, but now it's more broadly acquired. There's more consumer demand in year 8. Well, if it takes you 2 years to build a new factory, that means you maybe sometime in year 5, companies making consumer goods are going to need to have build more. They're going to have capital requirements, real capital requirements that are greater. Well, there are firms that make capital goods for firms that produce consumer goods. And there are firms that make capital goods for the capital good makers. And all this period of time is also, you're not just employing more capital, you're employing more labor. So there's a projected increase in consumer demand that really does telegraph all the way down to the very beginning of this process. And that's the case that you'd make. Now, to maintain market share, and the projected producers will have to increase production and therefore more fully utilize existing capacity and acquire more capacity. So this all begins before the income in year 8, 9, and 10 begins to be distributed. Now, some additional effects of broadening capital acquisition with its earnings, future earnings. As capital becomes more broadly distributed, welfare recipients are going to begin getting dividend checks. And government transfers can be reduced, and corporations whose shares provide that income can be given a tax credit. Think, for example, of a corporation who's broadened its ownership and the $100 dividend is distributed in year 8 to a welfare recipient. Well, you can take that welfare recipient $50 off the welfare rolls, still ahead, and you can give the corporation a $25 per share tax credit for incorporation that's done it. Tax credits. So there's a gain not only because if these people are buying more of the products, and again, we have to solve what's called the free rider collective action problem and operating on the aggregate. All the companies are doing this, but we'll deal with that. So the second thing is that as employees, customers, and neighbors that are not on welfare begin earning income, more capital income, they'll be in higher tax brackets. And here it should be noted that although the corporation earns income and can be taxed on it, most of the income is never passed on to the individual shareholders, the 1% up to about the 10%. There are some that are living on dividends, but most of that is retained earnings, and it's rarely taxed on an ordinary income basis to that 1% to the 10%, whereas it's usually taxed simply at a capital gains rate at some later point in time. With broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital and people moving into a situation where they're earning capital income by way of dividends, there will be an ordinary income tax bracket at that point. And it will increase the revenues for the government. And of course, you can give the corporations whose shares earn those partial tax credit for the increased revenues that the government gets from the more broadly distributed capital acquisition. Although wealthier people could be in higher tax brackets, the wealthier people are also pretty good at avoiding taxes through mechanisms. And this kind of income is also going to be entirely reportable because it's all coming through shares. But to some extent, to some extent, employees, customers, neighbors, and some welfare recipients that now are off welfare begin earning higher income. The taxes revenues will increase, and you can again provide tax benefits to the corporations whose shares earn that. And you can also get general reduced tax rates. There is the option, moving ahead, of reduced government deficits. And tax rates can be reduced. It's possible you can reduce tax rates and get the same revenues. You can keep the tax rates the same and get more revenues. That means for infrastructure and other things. Or you might even get more revenues through reduced tax rates. But it's all growth enhancing. All of these effects are growth enhancing. Government revenues will increase to the extent that what we call sovereign creditworthiness is a function of government expenses in relationship to GDP, that ratio will improve. Now, here's an additional feature that doesn't immediately apparent. As poor and working people are provided more competitive means of acquiring the least risky, most insurable capital acquisition, that's the ones that they're going to get, because if it's not insurable, if the price of insurance is too high, it's not going to be creditworthy to finance it this way. It will be too expensive. The insurance premiums themselves will be what you might call a a way of separating the ones that will work for poor and working people from the ones that won't. That's what the market is supposed to do. So existing owners, if they're no longer, I want to say, occupying 100% of the safest investment, no longer, you could say, hogging it up, because now institutions enable poor and working people to compete with them in the most insurable capital acquisitions. Either they have to keep their money in a very, very low income paying device like a money market or another mattress, or they'll have to move further out in what they call in the risk curve. Well, moving out further in the risk curve increases the riskiness, but also generally for the higher risk companies that succeed, pays higher returns. So you're talking about more financial capital for startups, for technological innovators, from entrepreneurs of various sorts, for smaller companies like the co-op companies. ESOPs are an advantage for the big companies, but not always an advantage for co-ops. This could provide that kind of financing, which of course typically enhances smaller companies probably employ more people per unit of investment than rich companies. At least that some people argue that. So these are additional benefits. The growing capital-based consumer demand generated by financing will make capital investment more creditworthy. Why? Because you've got a bigger consumer demand out there, less risky, and therefore more insurable, less expensive, and more profitable. The converse of that is if the economy had operated with less ownership broadening, capital investment would be riskier, therefore more expensive, and less capital investment would be creditworthy and profitable. Those are reciprocal relationships that exist. If it turns out that you have a broadening distribution of capital acquisition, so the supply generated by technological change and increased investment will be increasingly balanced with the corresponding increase in demand, the amplitudes of booms and busts should be dampened. When you think about the recessions of 2007-8 and the COVID recession, it's labor that really took the big hit. Capital by around 2012 or 14 had largely recovered. And even now today, it's labor that's taking the big hit. It's not capital that takes the hit. Earning income from labor and capital is simply a more diversified mechanism of earning. And even in downturns, there's more resiliency if you've got that diversification. Booms and busts the cycle should be reduced. Also, the word will tame business cycles of boom and bust. And of course, because of the increasing balance between productive capacity of increasingly intensive capital production and the distribution of ownership, systemic risk should decrease. Those are all theoretical points, but I think there's some logic to them. There's a plausibility to them all. And again, as we talked about, you don't have to wait till you're 8, 9, and 10 for these effects. They telegraph earlier into the system because capital investment is always forward-looking. The increased future demand is in year 8 and 9, occasions an increased demand in year 5, 6, and 7, and 4, 5, and 6, and 3, 4, 5, and it gaps up to the first year. We look at when some people complain that Social Security is not solvent. They're not saying it's not going to be solvent next year. The financial warners of doom and gloom, they're already looking 15 and 20 years out. This speaks to that time frame. And so it's a very important process. And this is not a bad time to distinguish it from Keynes. Keynes is talking about redistributing over a short period of time, short run. This is a long time application of the idea of broadening capital acquisition with units of capital, and it's not redistributed. Keynes once said, in the long term, we're all dead. That's not true. Long term is just this time in which capital acquisitions are variable. A 10-year-old becomes a 17-year-old. A 17-year-old becomes a 24-year-old. People need capital acquisition throughout the long run of their lives. People who live 50, 60, 70 are living in the long run. They're not all dead. That's just wrong. Ownership broadening is not redistribution. Now, I've said that more before. Let's go back to these knocks on the door. We've got Bill, Warren, Paris. She could have an idea too. And you've got Vanguard and TIAA-CREF. Let's suppose we're only 4 or 5 years out where this thing becomes widely taught in universities. So there are only a few members of the board that really convincingly believe that that capital does work just like labor does work. Technology makes capital more productive than labor, and you're going to get a growth in broadening capital, but not a majority of the board. They don't think it. Well, we might be right. Boards might be reticent to do this in the first few years that this is widely taught. So we say, well, we look at these alternatives and we say, well, we think Warren's got the best offer. So we sell the shares to Warren, and we, instead of borrowing the money, we get the synergy gain with Warren. Can Bill come back and say, hey, you redistributed something? We'll say, no, Bill, you don't have a right to buy all the capital in the world. You have a right to compete for competitive acquisition, and you didn't come up with the most competitive offer. And if convinced on the principles of binary economics, based on these basic principles, inclusive capitalism based on Lewis Kelso's binary economics, if it turns out that we think ownership broadening is really the thing that enhances corporate wealth the most, then it's just the most competitive offer. It's just the most competitive offer. Not a penny weight's worth of redistribution is needed for this growth. Of course, the mainstream political economic debate doesn't focus exclusively on fuller employment. Increasingly, environmental sustainability is a part of that mainstream debate. And broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital does speak to that question of environmental sustainability. Binary growth brings with it the potential for environmental degradation. Obviously, if people are living more and more around the world in the style of the American middle class, you're going to have a degradation of environmental quality. What will happen to the ozone layer? What will happen to the carbon footprint? These are real concerns. But I think it's also fair to say that the broadening of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will make greener technologies and environmental preservation more affordable, and also environmental regulation more politically achievable. Many greener technologies that are theoretically available simply are not affordable. Solar is becoming more affordable, but it'll be much more affordable with broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. In the big picture, technological processes which are environmentally destructive have to be dealt with in one of two ways. Either you have to substitute the environmentally destructive processes with environmentally friendly processes that people can afford, or you have to, in some sense, control them and prohibit them. And in both instances, broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital makes these problems more solvable. The other element is voluntary population control. Early support for Lewis Kelso's approach came from people who are concerned about population control and wanted to achieve it voluntarily. Well, the statistics pretty well indicate that the populations that control the population are those that have a large, stable middle class. And again, broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will achieve that. In the long run, technological progress will address environmental sustainability, but sustainability requires not only sustainable production, but also sustainable earning capacity. And again, binary economics speaks to that. Difficulty is that this needs to be within the mainstream dialogue, and that means that these principles need to be widely taught. And as they are widely taught and as they achieve recognition within the mainstream dialogue, the cause of employee ownership will be benefited by that. Okay. Now, up until now, in looking at this issue, we have not been focusing on how you move it down to the individual level. We've been looking at N corporation from the point of view of it's like every corporation. And that leads to what's called the free rider or collective action problem. Corporations engaged in ownership broadening financing are likely not to bet proportionally from their contribution to aggregate growth. The employee capitalizes its employees, customers, neighbors, and welfare recipients, they may not spend all their money on that producer's product. There'll be other companies that will be benefiting by the broader distribution of demand that's created by the ownership broadening company. Non-participating corporations and minimally participating corporations will free ride on the aggregate growth contributions of the participating corporations. So now we have to see how this would be brought down to the individual level. First of all, it's important to recognize that some of these factors do end up being addressed inherently by the process of any individual companies broadening its capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. To the extent that a company capitalizes its employees, you're going to get increased employee productivity. That's something that's studied by many of the good scholars and the researchers that are involved in these Kelso workshops and the Beister Institute programs. By the same token, to the extent a company capitalizes its customers, you're going to get the customer loyalty factor. If, for example, Walmart capitalizes its customers and Kmart does not, Walmart may actually draw clientele from people who are otherwise Kmart customers. There are also neighborhood effects. To the extent that a company capitalizes its employees, customers, neighbors, and welfare recipients in a company town, even though not all the broadly distributed capital income is spent on the company's products, it'll be spent on other merchants, other providers within that community, and the individual citizens in that community will be better able to support taxes for schools and services and infrastructure within the town. It'll make the town a more attractive place to bring quality employees. So there'll be neighborhood effects that will be gained.
But still, there will be non-ownership broadening companies that will benefit by free riding on the broader distribution of demand created by the ownership broadening companies.
One alternative is to mutualize what you could call the accounts of complementary producers and to persuade other companies to involve in this. Consider this from the point of view of three different kinds of companies. One company would be like Walmart or Procter & Gamble or even the internet companies like Amazon company, where the employees, customers, neighbors, and welfare recipients really are spending money on the kind of products made by that producer. Kind of a middle company would be a company that makes a specialty product. Let's suppose N-Corp makes automobiles. And the hardest company of all would be a company like an airline manufacturer, that its customers are either going to be governments, airline companies,
major corporations, and multimillionaires and billionaires.
Not many other people are going to buy a jet plane. So let's look at all those different alternatives. And let's see how we can address the free rider collective action problem. To the extent that a company like a specialty company making automobiles, our company makes automobiles, well, their employees, customers, neighbors, welfare recipients may not spend that increased money on the company's products. And to the extent that they buy cars, they may buy other producers' cars, or they'll be spending money on food, clothing, other kinds of things. Well, the airlines, in a sense, have dealt with that problem in a constructive way. I happen to fly a lot on American Airlines, and so I can use my frequent flyer miles on American Airlines, but people may want to fly to places that American doesn't fly. So Americans has cooperated with the complementary producers, that is, say, airlines that fly elsewhere, so you can use your frequent flyer miles on all of the syndicate airlines that are producing globally. United Airlines does not have the same group. It's organized a different group. Well, you could imagine if we're a car company that we would say, well, we relate to the National Association of Manufacturers, other producer groups, If we can get a company that produces food, a company that produces clothing, shelter, entertainment products, healthcare, there are only so many things that customers buy. You get a few producers in each of those fields and to work together and to mutualize the beneficiary accounts so that every producer in this group has a major part of the investment of their employees invested in the company's specific stock, but also in a diversified portfolio of some of these other producers.
These groups of complementary producers could work out a formula for revenue sharing based on the relative contribution of their more broadly acquired shares to the total contributions of the more broadly acquired shares of the complementary producers in the group.
Kelso many years ago proposed the idea of mutualizing, creating MUSAPs. Some of that can be done without government legislation. Some government legislation would probably be helpful in that. That's another way of addressing the collective action problem, the free rider problem. One way that could be done that probably would not require legislation is through the terms of the ownership plans themselves. Imagine that the terms of the shares that are issued to the trust for the benefit of the employees, customers, neighbors, and welfare recipients provide that the dividends, while they're being used to repay the lender, are payable in cash. But once the lender has been repaid, the dividends are payable in producer credits. They can be used or sold at a discount to purchase the production of participating corporations, so that there would be restriction on that. Now, think of the airline producers, the Boeings of the world. Their neighbors, their employees, their welfare recipients are going to buy airplanes. But the trust could work with the company to provide that these credits would be transferable to a customer that would like to buy an airplane. Suppose you go to an airline that says, well, you want to buy a $10 million plane. If you give $9 million to the trust will sell you the credits for $10 million. So you get the plane at a $10 million at 10% discount. The beneficiaries now have cash. Why do they have 90% of the cash they otherwise would have done? So a trading mechanism through the trusts would enable to transfer these producer credits, only payable, usable in producer goods, would be sold at a discount to those wanting to do it. And the beneficiaries that aren't going to spend money on the producer products will get the dividends at a slightly discounted amount. Well, they're still ahead. They haven't invested their own money to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. They haven't taken a personal risk for that, and they're still way ahead. And this reduces the free rider collective action problem. And of course, you don't have to bring the free rider collective action problem down to zero for it to be a gain. The gain simply has to be that whatever dilution the existing owners lose by bringing in more owners. Let's say that the existing owners of a company starts owning 100%, and by broadening ownership, they end up owning 70%. Well, there has to be enough of a gain to compensate them for their percentage dilution in the company. That's achievable. We already noted with the idea of government policies that if you give tax credits to the company whose shares are earning the additional income, that's something there's no free riding it. That all goes to the company whose ownership broadening increased the demand for the income distributed by the more broadly ownership. And we see that in terms of welfare recipients and increased tax revenues that go to people who otherwise wouldn't have acquired the capital. So, and then the general idea of mutualizing all of these, which I mentioned above, could be facilitated by government policy. So those are all ways in which the free rider collective action can be addressed. But again, they're not going to be addressed until the principles are widely taught. Moving on, there are additional ways of facilitating ownership broadening capital acquisition. I mentioned before that Lewis Kelso always includes the idea of a market-based government system of capital credit insurance. Once you understand that broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital is good in the sense that it promotes fuller employment of resources and a fuller employment of people, and that you need two sources of repayment, the cash flow of the ownership broadening investment, and you need a source of collateral, which could be capital credit insurance. Well, the bigger the pool of insured activity, the lower the risk. And the biggest pool you would get would be an economy-wide pool backed up by the government. Now, it doesn't have to be full faith and credit of the government. It could be simply limited to the initial appropriation that the government transferred to the government reinsurer, and that appropriation would slowly and steadily be replaced by the premiums that are paid by the lender that's seeking the insurance, and that would, of course, be passed on to the borrower. And eventually, it would be simply funded by the revenues generated by the insurance premiums. Lewis Kelso always argued that in a democratic society, the well-being of the economy as a whole is the key to maintaining political popularity. And if government is governing during an economy where the bottom falls out of the economy, that government will be turned out if it's a democratic society, and some competing party will take over. So the government is already, in a sense, vouching for, underwriting the well-being of the economy, and that the government pool of reinsurance simply underwrites that in terms that have a practical capital significance in a rational, economic-based sort of way. And then we also mentioned the idea of central bank monetization. Now that takes a little bit of explanation. And so I'm going to try to describe. Now we've got, here we had the privately based ownership broadening that we talked about with Company N. And now we add the capital credit reinsurance, government sponsored, which need not be full faith and credit. And now we've got the central bank in terms of monetization. Say a little bit about monetization. First of all, we already monetize throughout the economy. If you have an economy that's growing like the US economy, the default rate of, let's say, 2%, 2 to 3% a year, well, too much monetization creates inflation. That's the idea of too much money chasing too few goods. But too little money in the system creates an even more feared phenomenon, and that's deflation. Deflation is feared because at least with inflation, if you don't, it's good not to have too much of it. There's an incentive to spend money before it inflates. And our government and the central banks of most countries try to program in a 2% inflation rate. Why is that? Because there's more fear of deflation than inflation. With deflation, the purchasing power of money is increasing. So there's a tendency to hoard it. And you can move down into what's called a deflationary spiral. So as if the economy is growing at a default rate of 2% real, and you're programming a 2% inflation rate to guard against deflation, you're always having to increase the money supply. How do we do it now? The central bank has the open market committee that purchases government bonds. You're basically purchasing and retiring financial instruments that represent government borrowing. When government borrows, it's not always repaid by the taxpayer. Some of it is simply retired by the central bank acquiring the ownership of the bonds that otherwise would require taxpayers to pay the interest and the principal on. So we're already doing that. That's monetizing past spending. The other alternative, which Kelso proposed, would be to monetize capital acquisition. Well, how does monetization work? When a lender loans to a trust to invest in company stock, to create that process where the dividends repay the lender has a promissory note. It's an asset on its books. If it tenders it to the Fed can increase a credit at probably 95.75%, in other words, 0.25% discount, to the bank. So the bank has almost another amount of money that can reloan, almost the face amount of the note that it tendered to the central bank. And it can reloan that. So in effect, the lender, if this is discounted, is not really lent other people's financial savings. Nobody worked for that monetized credit. It's not the past savings, so it doesn't have to earn prime interest rate, the competitive rates that the banks get for lending other people's past savings. So instead of lending it at prime, you can lend it the real cost of that monetized credit. Well, what is the real cost of that monetized credit? It's set forth in this slide here. The central bank's discount rate was probably 0.25%. That's about the smallest unit that you use in this kind of measuring for the cost of the discounting. The capital credit insurance, Lewis Kelso estimated that at 2 to 3%. That's what FHA insurance tends to cost. For homes, and America's 3,000 creditworthy companies have better financial risks than home buyers entitled to FHA insurance. The banker earns an overall spread on the money that it manages. That's the service charge. You have to find good loan prospects. You have to examine their capital acquisition plans, short and long term. You have to see the quality of the management. You have to draft the loan papers. You have to pay attorneys to draft the terms. You have to monitor the loans, and sometimes, unfortunately, you have to collect. That's the banker spread. It's a service charge. And so that would total 4.5% to 5.5% loans. Well, that's the same kind of interest rate that's roughly the kind of prime rate that companies get. But if you had to pay for the capital insurance on top of that, ownership broadening financing would be 5, if they had 5, maybe up to 7%. Well, the way you eliminate that extra couple of percent that the capital credit insurance pays on top of the loans through conventional financing, you do that through the central bank monetization. So you can bring down the cost of capital credit financing for new owners, for the employees, customers, neighbors, welfare recipients, by central bank monetizing. Well, should we monetize past government spending, or should we monetize ownership broadening capital acquisition? That's a public policy. The principles of binary economics don't say that you should do it one way or the other, but the numbers would suggest that if binary capital acquisition produces a lot more fuller employment, in other words, if the binary economic growth is big, then you can probably reduce government debt more by ownership broadening than you can by purchasing government bonds through the open market committee. It's a policy decision that would have to be made, but you don't even get there until the principles are widely appreciated. My own view is that capital acquisition and capital production, real capital production, its productiveness is so great that it'd be better to monetize capital acquisition than it would be to monetize past government spending, because you're going to have much less government spending needed if you broaden capital acquisition. We have to see. The prices are going to change. And of course, institutions like the Ford Foundation that want to eliminate inequality in all of its forms, it could also lower the cost of financing by loaning money at the 0% interest, and by providing the capital credit insurance at a lower rate than the rate that we have up there. Ford Foundation, eleemosynary groups interested in the welfare of poor and working people can certainly participate in ownership broadening activities, but not until they come to understand those activities. I don't think there's a major official in any of these foundations that understands the principles of binary economic growth. I wish they did. I'm ready to teach them. I've offered to foundations, I'll come there for free. I will have to pay wine me. I mean, I'm not asking for any money. I just want to teach these principles to you. Several foundations have not taken me up on it yet. Maybe someday they will. So moving back, we move to from the private entirely. We get these two different institutions, and again moving something back. Once you've got central bank monetization and government reinsurance, you're probably creating an incentive, an additional incentive for ownership broadening financing. That's in the banks. If a bank is getting monetized credit, it can make one more loan with its capital base, its ratio of capital investment of its investors, and its depository base, compared to a bank that doesn't make an ownership broadening loan. Now, of course, there might be a moral hazard in that, but you can regulate that moral hazard. You could provide that the only banks that can do the discounting loans that are eligible to tender notes for the purposes of discounting must have a zero or a very low default rate compared to other banks. So you actually have an incentive for ownership broadening financing. And once you've got this advantage, and then you're going back to what I said before, you can begin to control environment and sustainability by saying we're going to restrict monetized, government reinsured capital investment to environmentally sustainable operations. We're not going to finance brown industry. Now, that does involve government decision making. I'm not saying it's necessary. I'm just saying that this tool can be used by people who say government is the problem. And this tool can be used by people to say we need government in the solution. You can pass more environmental regulations, more health regulations, more regulations that increase the cost of production if people can afford it. If somebody wants to resist a regulation that improves health or something, well, that's a job killer. Well, it's not as much of a job killer if people can afford it. So those are all positive things. Conclusion: a broader and deeper understanding of inclusive capitalism based on Lewis Kelso's binary economics will help move employee ownership to the center of the mainstream political economic debate, because it will greatly assist in achieving the goals espoused by the proponents of austerity and stimulus and the mix of the two, including enhanced earnings for poor and middle class people, enhanced corporate and shareholder profits, reduced need for welfare dependence, government spending and borrowing, and provide for reduced tax rates, enhanced retirement security. I didn't mention that before, but retirement security will be better because the value of the shares in the retirement account will be higher. Enhanced sovereign creditworthiness, reduced systemic risk, and enhanced sustainable fuller employment and per capita growth and greater efficiency. Overview of inclusive capitalism based on principles of binary economics. Labor and real capital both do work. Technology makes capital much more productive than labor and task after task after task. And a broader distribution of capital acquisition provides the rational expectation of greater consumer demand in future years, and therefore greater demand for fuller employment of labor and capital in earlier years. And that's the principle of binary economic growth. Summary of its implementation: inclusive capitalism provides an entirely voluntary means to enable creditworthy corporations to acquire any portion of their capital requirements, while simultaneously enabling employees, customers, neighbors, welfare recipients, and others to acquire with non-recourse, insured, perhaps government reinsured, perhaps monetized credit, not necessary, to acquire full dividend corporate shares of participating companies, which would pay their full return, net of depreciation, research, and development reserves, first to repay the capital acquisition loan obligations, and then to provide a capital source of income to supplement wages and welfare benefits and reduce welfare dependence. The system is entirely voluntary as a system of corporate finance. It requires no taxes, no redistribution, no government borrowing, and no government command. But it provides a more competitive system of private property rights, one that enables market participants voluntarily to price the value of broader capital acquisition. Corporations would be free to continue to meet their capital requirements as before, but they would have an additional, potentially more profitable market means of doing so. It'd be their choice. Governments would be better able to pursue whatever mix of austerity and stimulus it deems best. The poly is an add-on, not an alternative to the existing debate. Continuing the conclusion, a broader and deeper understanding of inclusive capitalism based on binary economics is in the best interest of those who favor employee ownership, because it provides powerful insights regarding the big picture operation of capitalist economies, how capitalism can be made to be much more inclusive, the importance of the competitive right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, how promoting and expanding employee and broader ownership will benefit society, how the benefits of employee and broadening ownership are highly relevant to the great austerity stimulus debate that dominates mainstream political and economic discourse, and how employee ownership can move much closer to the center of the mainstream political economic debate. Now, I want to just say a few things about capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. First of all, it's happening every moment. It's how almost all capital is acquired. It's the essence of capitalism. And then one of the tests of whether an idea like this is important and new is, does it enable you to look at history in a new and important way? It's the economic basis of the Cold War. The whole 20th century, if you eliminate that horrible Nazi interlude, was whether the competitive right to acquire capital within the earnings of capital would remain privatized, parenthesis, in a plutocracy, close parenthesis, in proportion to existing wealth, or whether it would be outlawed. That's the essence of communism. Communism didn't outlaw private property. You could always own a house or a car or even a cow, which is petty capitalism, but you couldn't own the means of production and engage in that wonderful process whereby capital acquires itself with the earnings of capital. Whether that would remain privatized or whether it would be outlawed, that's the essence of communism. Then it's the most important economic property right that people need, but don't know they need. Now I'm going to go back to this one for a minute. During the Cold War, in the 50s and the 60s, I remember getting down underneath the tables where I lived in the Midwest because of the fear that the Russians were going to come and nuke us. And there was a movement in Great Britain that grew out of the 30s and the 40s when people couldn't figure out how to solve the Depression before the Second World War enabled us to borrow our way out of the recession. Credit for blood, but not credit for acquiring capital with the earnings of capital. There was a movement in Great Britain that said better red than dead, because they thought that capitalism didn't have the way of solving poor middle class problems. And our nation said, no, better dead than red. And that's what the government in the UK said, and France and Western Germany. Better dead than red. Well, we were willing to go to nuclear war over preserving the competitive right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital, but restricted to the rich. If it's important enough to go to nuclear war over, then in a democracy that requires consent to the governed, isn't it important that people understand the importance of the competitive right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital? This is the most important economic right that people need, but don't know they need. Isn't it important that this be a part of the educational process? I don't know how many times I've said that when I speak at universities, I've spoken around the country and actually around the world, universities. Another generation of students should not graduate from this institution, from the institutions that are represented at this conference, this ownership, this council conference, shouldn't graduate without an understanding of the principles of inclusive capitalism based on Lewis Kelso's binary economics, and they should understand that capital does work just as labor does work, and that technology makes capital more productive than labor, and that a broader distribution of capital acquisition with the earnings of capital will promote growth And there are ways of solving the capital acquisition free rider problems and the other problems associated with it if only people focus on the basic principles and begin to teach and learn about it. And that this speaks to environmentally sustainable processes and also environmentally sustainable learning capacity. Those are all things that are related here and that are important. And of course, it's one way of moving employee ownership from the periphery to the center of the economic debate. So capital acquisition with the earnings of capital is a very important subject. And if, as I say, if it's important enough to go to a nuclear war over, it's important enough to teach the people. And then universities have an obligation to do that. Now, what can lawyers do to help and teachers do to help? Well, they can learn and teach the principles of inclusive capitalism. Folks, we haven't done anything more really than use fourth grade math, adding, subtraction, multiplication, division, percentages, ratios, fractions. That's all it takes. It doesn't take calculus to understand broadening capital acquisition with the earnings of capital. The important role of the lawyer, I teach my students this, is to assist clients in identifying and securing their essential rights and responsibilities. Well, I think that's important. And there's something else they can do, but I'm going to postpone that for a second. But that's what lawyers can do and teachers can do, all teachers. What can economists do? Well, they can learn and teach the principles of inclusive capitalism based on binary economics. Instead of dismissing it because it's not a part of left-wing and right-wing strategies, classical, neoclassical, and Keynesian economics, maybe they need to broaden their horizons and say, maybe we don't know everything already. And to the extent that economists have clients too, they should assist them to identify and secure their essential economic interests. And they can do one more thing, and now I'll tell you what that is. This is new. They can sign the Economist's letter in support of inclusive capitalism. I have 10 signatures from economists, PhDs in economics, characterizing inclusive capitalism as the most important contribution to economic theory in many decades. We should have many more economists signing that letter. And they can do that.
I'm going to ask that the good people at the Rutgers School of Management and Labor Relations and the Beister Institute post this letter on their website and help me to get more signatures from economists supporting this idea.
There must be 15 to 20 economists that are on record, that are part of this group that is promoting employee ownership. Well, I think their names should be on this letter. This is the most important one, in my opinion. Well, maybe there's another one that's more important. We'll name it if it's more important. But this is a very important concept. Now, some people say, well, I don't want to sign it because I don't know everything that's important. I haven't learned it all. Well, anytime someone says this is the most important idea, implicitly it states that this is the most important idea you know about. Nobody who signs this letter says they know everything. But if there's a more important idea than this one, then please identify it. Otherwise, the economists that are part of this employee ownership group, they should be signing this letter. Their names belong on it. Or explain why it's not important. What can ESOP and co-op companies, executives, fiduciaries, practitioners, and advisors do to help? Well, they can do the same thing. They can learn and teach the principles of inclusive capitalism based upon binary economics and teach it to their employees too. You know, with the ESOPs, they have these employee booklets. Every employee booklet should have the story that places the ESOP as a part of a bigger picture. I've written an article that's entitled Binary Economics, the Economic Theory That Arrived to ESOPs. I have the copyright in that. I waive the copyright. This should be in the booklets, or a condensed version of it should be in the booklets. The ESOP Association and others go to Washington to lobby. If 10 million employees understood this, that would strengthen their hand in terms of lobbying and make incentives for employee ownership much more easily achievable. What can people who favor employee ownership do? They can do the same thing. They can learn and teach the principles of inclusive capitalism based on Lewis Kelso's binary economics. Assist workers and students to understand these same essential principles. So, urge economists to sign that letter. That would be a way of doing that. So, this has been a long presentation. I welcome your comments and your questions. Anything I can do to promote this idea, I'm dedicated to doing so. And I hope that this has been of value to you. Thank you for your kind attention.
Good day. My name is David Bieri. I'm an associate professor of public policy and of economics at Virginia Tech, and I'm truly delighted to have been invited to share with you some reflection on Robert Ashford's work on employee ownership, inclusive capitalism, and binary economics. I've known Professor Ashford for about 5 years now and have really enjoyed our friendly exchanges on the topics of inclusive capitalism and binary economics in particular. And so today, what I would like to do is, rather than to give you, to the extent that it's even possible, a complete blow-by-blow account of my agreements or disagreements with Professor Ashford's work, rather I'd like to give you some broad-based reflections on how I think, from my own disciplinary vantage point, as also a historian of economic ideas, where Ashford's work resides or can be placed in relation to the greats in the Hall of Fame of economics. And in order for us to do this today, we must begin with what perhaps seems relatively strange and simple questions, because Ashford's work engages with the very core of economics, and that is the work on the nature of capitalism. What is capitalism? What is its evolutionary future? And as such, what are the different forms of economic governance? We know the two extremes: a complete market-based economy, or a complete an economy that is described by central planning. And so as such, what Ashford's work engages with is the very question of who controls, as it were, the commanding heights of the economy. And thus, how is the ownership of the means of production, to introduce a term that Karl Marx has first used, best described? In that sense, one is tempted to say that Ashford's work is so revolutionary that most modern economists have technical difficulties with said work. But do they have better technical ability, yet understand less? And so for us to engage in the broadest sense with Ashford's work, we must ask ourselves, what are the insights that we can gain from what I describe, the Kelso-Ashford theory of inclusive capitalism, in light of these very broad questions? Now, a very useful starting point, I think, is to take one of the perhaps greatest and least well-known economists of the 20th century, that is Joseph Schumpeter, and his definition of capitalism. By capitalism, he writes in 1928, we mean our economic system that is an economic system characterized by three particular types of criteria, namely that it's a system where private property, that is private initiative, is core, where production happens for a marketplace, and thirdly, and perhaps in some ways most importantly, the phenomenon of credit is present. This, so Schumpeter argues, is the differentia specifica that distinguishes the capitalist system from other species of economic arrangements, both that have existed in history before or that are potentially possible. And so it's these three aspects of capitalism: private property, the production for market, and the phenomenon of credit, that define capitalism. And what I will argue for the remainder of my session on comments or reflections on Ashford's work is that Ashford squarely engages these very three elements that Schumpeter tells us are at the core of economic analysis. Now, these three elements, private property, production of market, and the phenomenon of credit, in some ways are no longer really at the core of the ideational analysis in mainstream economic. And so Ashford's work brings us back to engage the most essential issues in his theory of inclusive capitalism, with private property rights, the production for marketplace, and the phenomenon of credit. And so what is the challenge of inclusive capitalism? You will have heard that it rests on three key principles. First, the idea that labor and capital perform work separately. This is a very new idea, and as such does not exist in the history of ideas explicitly as such. Secondly, technology makes capital more productive than labor. And thirdly, perhaps in some ways, most importantly, that the broader distribution of capital acquisition with the future earnings of capital promises greater demand and thus fuller employment and therefore perhaps more growth in the future. So Ashford's theory of inclusive capitalism is a theory of fuller employment, not only of labor, but also of capital. So it addresses fuller employment of both labor and capital, which, as we will see in a short while, is also a novel contribution. It provides the rational basis for a theory of growth that rests on a key property right, which is the competitive right to acquire capital on market principles. And as such, it also shifts us away from a discussion that's currently, in some ways, occupying us all, which is the perennial discussion of what is government's role in redistributing resources, where on two extremes of the debate, you can have austerity or stimulus programs, sometimes referred to as the Keynesian position, where government stimulates in the absence of private market forces. The Ashford theory of inclusive capitalism is one that shifts us away from this sort of false dichotomy of austerity and stimulus, one to looking at the reallocation of resources on the basis of a credit-based employee ownership scheme. And as such, if we were to evaluate it by, again, zooming out in very broad brush terms, and I think this is very important in order to position it, we have in the theory of inclusive capitalism a kind of a new general theory of employment, interest, and money. This is, of course, a nod to John Maynard Keynes's great work of 1936, simply often referred to as the general theory, but it's in Keynes's case a theory of employment first and foremost, and a theory of interest and money in the second place. Ashford, like Keynes, challenges the reigning, then it was the reigning classical notion, today it's the reigning neoclassical notion of a dichotomy between the money sector or the money realm and the real realm, that they could be analyzed separately. Keynes brings in his general theory both money and the real sector together. And so the focus is not on cost or returns, or even the marginal efficiency of capital as it was in Keynes, but primarily on the formation of expectations. That is the key driver in Ashford's inclusive capitalism. It's a forward-directed, expectation-based theory where the central role is the firm as the institutional locus or the institutional form of capital. The firm is one of the key actors, and employee or labor is not opposed to the firm or, in a Marxian sense, dominated by firm or capital interests. No, capital and labor are unified in a new theory of the firm. So there are elements of Keynesian theory in Ashford's inclusive capitalism, and I think Professor Ashford would certainly not be offended by being by having the suggestion that his theory is in Keynesian lineage. But where he adds to Keynes is that his theory is not one where Keynes's general theory was of the short run, but it is a theory of the long run. The other very interesting element about Ashford's theory is that it has classical elements to it. Where Keynes was exclusively focused on the demand side of things, Ashford also includes, by virtue of having the firm as its analytical centerpiece, supply side elements to it. So his theory focuses on distribution and ownership, and not, as neoclassical theory does, on efficiency and equity alone. So in that sense, these are, it's in some ways the marriage of the best of both worlds. It's both Keynesian with a long run flavor and classical elements of supply side and distributional concerns. Now, if one must, and of course, there are many ways in which one can skin the historical pedigree of economic ideas, but if one must place Ashford or the Kelso-Ashford theory of inclusive capitalism in the pantheon of heterodox schools or orthodox schools, then it would be probably somewhere between post-Keynesianism and institutionalism that inclusive capitalism, the theory of inclusive capitalism, will have to be placed. The importance of this being, as you are probably all quite aware of, this being a heterodox dissenting view of the mainstream, is quite relevant here, because it can be said that in the history of economic ideas, it was very rare that innovation of an ideational nature would come from within the orthodoxy. So the majority of contributions to the growth of economic ideas has come from, as it were, the fringe. And so how then do we look at Keynes after Ashford? Well, we perhaps recall that Keynes reminds us, as does Ashford, of the power of ideas. So in that sense, above everything, I think, we must take inclusive capitalism very seriously as an idea, because ideas of economists and political philosophers, so Keynes says in 1936, both when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly understood. In fact, and I think it's very true today, the world is ruled by little else. Practical men, so Keynes continues, who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence, are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. That's still very true today. Madmen in authority, who hear voices in the air, are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. But soon or late, it is ideas and not vested interests per se, which are dangerous for good or evil. And I think on the ideational value or contribution of Ashford's work, we must insist. Because a lot of criticism is leveled at inclusive capitalism on the basis of mechanical details, some of which I'm not prepared to, or I think I've said in the beginning, I'm not prepared to go into the netherworlds of discussing all of these mechanical details, although for theory building, details are important. But today, I think the focus must be on the importance of ideas. Economics is a social science, and it's a social science that is driven by ideas and not mechanical truths. And as such, the power of inclusive capitalism resides on the one hand, sound mechanics, but on the other hand, on very powerful ideational discourse. And in that sense, let me just say a few things how in economics we have seen and learned that there is a connection between ideas, institutions, and events. It's in some ways our holy trinity. Ideas about the nature of capital have been driving economic theory, at least since the mercantilists, so for about 300 years. So what we can say is that there are two related sides of the nature of capital. On the one hand, we have the firm as the institutional form of capital. Firms are risk-sharing mechanisms, social transfer entities. And there is the money side as a distributional form of capital, money in terms of profits, or money in terms of credit, or money in terms of a simple medium of exchange, helps us understand capital. So there is an institutional side to capital and a distributive side to capital. And both elements, Ashford's work on inclusive capitalism engages with squarely, which is not something that can be said for a number of contemporary theories. And so in this sense, it's institutions that actually represent the socioeconomic arrangements that rest on and are influenced by specific ideas. And in the case of inclusive capitalism, the idea is very clear. It's employee-owned ownership, employee-based ownership of firms that form the basis for future growth. And in that sense, the firm at the core of capitalist analysis is one of the key contributions of Ashford in terms of understanding how both the money side as a distributional form of capitalism, of capital, and the institutional form of capital are joined in inclusive capitalism. The third element to the Trinity are historic events that have given rise to new theoretical insights and ideas. And in that sense, inclusive capitalism post-financial crisis, maybe even post-COVID, is an idea whose time has come. It would be far too lengthy for me to discuss why has Kelso in some ways failed or not been listened to in the 1950s and 60s. Is it because he was fundamentally wrong? No, of course not. In that sense, economics does not function like the natural sciences, where the contemporary knowledge is always the best knowledge. It's a wide acknowledgement amongst historians of thought that the reigning orthodoxy in economics might not necessarily represent the best possible knowledge. What it does represent is the most conventionally accepted ideas. And so in that sense, the historic events of undeniable inequality between the earnings of labor and the earnings of capital have given rise to a unique historic moment where the Kelso-Ashford conjecture of inclusive capitalism needs to be taken very seriously. So in that sense, allow me to conclude that the promise of inclusive capitalism stems from providing a very plausible argument for significant growth potential from employee ownership. That growth potential has a magnitude that flows from its three basic principles that we've seen in the beginning and the emphasis on productiveness rather than productivity, as is conventionally the case. An additional important contribution is to shift the focus away from the, in some ways, erroneous dichotomy of austerity versus stimulus that is dominating conventional public policy debates and is anchored in the assumption that there needs to be redistribution for growth. But inclusive capitalism provides us a third option that does not rely on this type of government intervention, but that relies on a reallocation of resources and in some ways generates growth endogenously from within. And at its core is, of course, the importance of employee ownership and we need to bring that idea into the mainstream. And as such, placing, as I've attempted to do in my brief comments, placing inclusive capitalism in a larger discursive context of what economists or how economists have been thinking is a very important task. And this important task must begin in some ways, and I'm very grateful for Robert to be an untiring champion of this principle. It must, of course, begin in the halls of the academy and in our curricula. And so I'm a great believer in diversity and inclusion, of the ideational sense, which means that we must begin to integrate inclusive capitalism into our teachings and provide more substance to the very purpose of university education, in the words of Oscar Wilde, who said, "The university education is primarily the ability to engage with ideas gracefully." And Ashford's work does that to the highest degree. In conclusion then, I would like to say that I believe that Ashford's theory of inclusive capitalism represents a vital piece of new economic thinking. But mainstream economists' own preoccupation with notions such as equilibrium and productivity, as opposed to disequilibrium and productiveness, which are key mechanisms in the theory of inclusive capitalism, prevent this theory from being absorbed into the mainstream. And in that sense, I agree with Professor Ashford that the competitive right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital is the most important right that people need, but do not know that they need it. And as such, it's not sufficiently understood. In order for us to change this understanding, we must, of course, teach the theory of inclusive capitalism very widely in our university courses, something that I've chosen to do last semester, and I'm very grateful to Professor Ashford that he made not one, but 3 appearances as a guest lecturer in my course on the history of economic ideas, where we were able to discuss the theory of inclusive capitalism within a larger scale and scope of other theories, ways of economic thinking, from Marx to Paul Krugman. And so the teaching of inclusive capitalism at the university level will also help us to understand my final point. And that is that with a better understanding and reception of the theory of inclusive capitalism into mainstream economic discourse, it highlights the very importance of employee ownership as a concept, as a vital concept of thinking about the firm in contemporary capitalism. And with that, I want to thank you for your kind attention and would very much appreciate if you had any thoughts or comments on my musings on the theory of inclusive capitalism, and would like to hear from you by email or otherwise. Thank you very much.